Welcome. Welcome on this wonderful, sunny, fresh day, and what a pleasure it is to all be together in person. So much fun to have you with us today. We've seen many of you on Zoom over the last couple of summits we've had, but what a pleasure to be back at Prince Philip House in this wonderful venue with a wonderful lineup of speakers. And thank you in advance to all our speakers who are sharing their time with us this afternoon. Now, I'm going to just do a little bit of scene setting, and I promise you, I'm the only presentation. So I have the benefit of just showing you a little bit of eye candy, which I think hopefully you'll find interesting, and will set the context for our afternoon together. A couple of housekeeping points we have to say. There is no fire alarm test, so if we hear one, it's the real thing. Back the way we came, outside the door, and turn left. The facilities are literally, as just before you walked in to register, and there's also some down on the -1 level. And I think, Reg, I'm looking at you, that's all I need to say for housekeeping, I think. And the only other thing I'd say before I start is a huge thank you to all in the ECHO team. This is never something that one does on one's own. There's a huge, huge, huge team and effort behind. Many are here today, some are not. And some of the things you'll see in the coffee break are also done by really talented ECHO team members, which we'll see when we get to that stage. So thank you to the ECHO team. Now, a little bit of scene setting. I want to share some perspectives for you that we see across the business community. As you will have seen, one of the things we run is Britain's Most Admired Company study. And that study is one of the longest running corporate reputation studies in this country, going now over 32 years. We poll across the entire FTSE, FTSE 100, FTSE 250, all the listed C-suite directors and their financial analysts. Now, in addition to rating each other, and the analysts rating the companies they follow, we also have a series of open-ended questions. And one of the questions this year was very much, top of mind concerns for the business community. And this is from primarily our chief executive and listed C-suite respondents coming through. And as you can see, it's sort of like today's headlines. Let's talk about inflation, cost of living, attracting and retaining talent. Where are all the human resources that we need? Climate change, ESG, supply chain, geopolitics, China, Russia, the States, recession risk, government political instability, regulation, we'll be talking about that in a moment, competitors, digital disruption, things you don't see, but we'll talk about in a moment, Brexit. Primarily not a concern because it's there, we have to deal with it, but we did explore some of the issues around Brexit as well. A lot of interesting things coming together, like the perfect storm. So I think if we all feel this time is like no other, the answer is true. It is like no other. It is a zeitgeist moment. When we specifically look at Brexit and say, okay, 5 years on, how has this impacted business? Now, bear in mind, this is across FTSE 100 and 250, all sectors. Certain of these things will impact certain sectors more significantly than others. Yeah? So number one, supply chain. And obviously, anyone that's connected with having to import anything, let alone semiconductors, writ large, biggest issue. Talent, how do we hire? And again, think of the hospitality industry on its knees to get the right talent that they need. International trade, clearly regulation again comes in, more regulation to deal with, not less, changing regulation, not less. And clearly, how do we remain profitable when one of our biggest markets has actually gone further away from us? So not only how has it affected them, one of the questions we asked is, well, what have you done differently as a result? And again, this is what our C-suites have come back and said, saying, well, actually, logically, risk management and everything, we're reviewing our supply chain. We have to. We're really thinking about how we do long-term planning to get the right talent and the employee throughput that we need. We're having to adapt to regulation. We're having to be more proactive and more anticipatory as to where that is moving and how that will affect us. Yes, we need to expand in the EU. Some have said nothing. There's some across the FTSE that genuinely serve primarily the UK market. For them, they've said not huge amount of change for them, but the vast majority of the FTSE that do trade, it is a significant issue. Again, remembering these are listed companies, move out of the UK was one of the answers. Focus on the UK, smaller answer, and as I say, risk management writ large across all of this in terms of how it's impacting organizations across the FTSE. Very much as I think Andrew Bailey said in today's news articles, it's the worst of all worlds coming together at the same time. So on that jolly note, within Britain's most admired companies, what we're fundamentally trying to do is understand what is driving reputation across the FTSE, across the listed companies. What are the table stakes and what are the must-have elements of reputation? But what are the areas that are sort of the golden triangle, if you like, that differentiate the best from the rest? Table stakes, and this has been proved time and time and time again over the years of this study, the most important criteria for any organization is the quality of its products and services. Number one, no question. Behind that, obviously financial soundness, quality of management, and increasingly long-term value potential. Yeah? Particularly given the economic situation we find ourselves in. The golden triangle's over here. Yeah? Talent, innovation, fundamental, inspirational leadership driving that, and clearly anything to do with ESG and sustainability initiatives that, by the way, are all linked. Yeah? The question again we asked newly this year was actually, of all these issues, what do you think is going to be more important looking ahead over the next 2 or 3 years? And the answer was ESG is going to rise in importance, primarily driven by compliance, but not exclusively, followed by talent, and capacity to innovate. Again, very closely linked. That is the CEO view. I'll then take you to what I would call the CCO view, which is the Chief Communication Officer view, those supporting organizations to achieve their reputational aims, meeting the expectations of the stakeholders. And this is work that we do for the Page Society, which represents the largest CCOs around the world, primarily US, but not exclusively, with good representation across Europe and Asia as well. And this was a feedback we had and said, what are the concerns you have? And you'll see there's a very close echo to the feedback we had from chief executives. Yeah? War, economic stability, sustainability, the role of the CEO in public discourse. I know we'll talk about that. How do you react in a world where there's outrage all the time? Yeah? And then increasingly we'll be judged by actions, not words. How do we make it happen? How do we make it real? How do we have a narrative that's authentic? Increasingly culture, diversity, all these things play through. When we said in terms of ranking of importance, the recognition of the role of the CCO to their organizations, number 1 and 2 combined, clearly driving, curating the right cultures up there. Number 1, if I just isolated the single most important one that everyone rated number 1, was actually demonstrating tangible business value. But when you put 1 and 2 together, we get this kind of split coming all the way through. Right the way down to navigating polarizing societal issues. Again, something we're talking about today in terms of how do you balance conflicting, what can seem like conflicting priorities. So again, measurements focusing on organizational outcomes, fundamental. Yeah? Sustainability and ESG targeting, benchmarking reputation. Interestingly, people's awareness of our purpose and their involvement in purpose. Again, I'm sure we'll be talking about that this afternoon. Different ways of measuring reputation and also very much listening. That active engagement of listening to where stakeholders and employees are going. So just to finish up, one of the things we often talk about is the equation of reputation, which is reputation R equals P, which is performance, less expectations. So your performance can be great, but if those expectations are changing, which they are, that equation will start to suffer. Yeah? So what are we doing about our performance, both operational and cultural alignment to that performance, and how does that stack up against stakeholder and societal expectations? So this particular formula is dynamic. It changes. What worked 5 years ago clearly is different now for this reason. And why is this important? As you'll have seen in Harvard Business Review, BCG, PwC, McKinsey, all the leading consultancy firms coming together, even Davos coming together and talking about the necessity of being resilient. The shocks just don't stop. They're going to keep happening. How do we build resilient organizations that can actually thrive in the future? So with that, I'm delighted that you're all with us. These are the things we'll be unpicking in our sessions this afternoon. And again, a warm welcome to our speakers. And I'm delighted to invite on stage our first session, Neil Sherlock, who is our non-executive chairman. Delighted to have him with us. And you'll find his biography if you scan the QR code. So I won't read the bio, but I'll say two things. One is that Neil, one of his claim to fame is that he beat hands down a certain young Boris Johnson for the presidency of the Oxford Union Club. We know what happened to Boris. But since then, Neil went on to many things, including partner at PwC, partner at KPMG, special advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister, and on many, many, many trusts throughout the country. So with that, Neil, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, Sandra, thank you very much for that and for reminding everybody that all I did was slow Boris Johnson down slightly rather than stop him. So thank you for reminding that. But look, I'm absolutely thrilled today to have Mike Rake with me. Mike's had a stellar and continuing career across some of the great names in business and has faced these sorts of challenges that are now very clear in business. You've advised prime ministers, you've advised the royal family, you've done this around the world, Mike. And I think it's interesting now that when you look, for example, at Collins in their English dictionary have introduced this year a new word called permacrisis, meaning that we're in a constant period of instability, economic and political. And I think certainly when I was working for you, one of the great things was that there was a degree of stability. The Berlin Wall had come down. There was a sort of what we thought then, Russia democratically electing a president, China economically opening up. And now that seems to have been reversing because of nationalism, because of war, because of protectionism, and we're seeing a very different world. So I wonder within that, if you could let's just pick one of the many things you've done. I mean, BT, when you became the chair of BT, 1 million shareholders, trade unions, regulators, government, massive public expectation, probably everybody a client of BT. So how did you then balance those conflicting goals that probably all of those had as the chair? And what lessons do you draw out from that for today for business leaders?
I think two things first. I mean, one is these slides, I think, summarize what just about everyone I meet thinks and knows, and we need to address that. I think the other thing is really clear. We've always needed leadership and values from the top. Never been more important, because we've completely lost it politically, and we need to re-establish that politically. And if you look what goes on in companies, it's so far ahead of what we've seen politically. And the resilience point is there. And really addressing that, we've had the sort of really, the wall went down, we stopped spending money on defense, then we had the financial crisis, then we had cheap money, and we had a few more golden years, and now we've got this, and it's probably the most complex thing I've ever seen, where we've got all of this that everyone has, if you will, whether it's the hangover from COVID, the inflation, perhaps with hindsight, a little bit too much quantitative easing and the impact of that on labour. And then we've added to it Brexit and political instability that's destroyed our reputation for a short period of time, hopefully. All of this means that the points you're making have always been there about leadership, values, resilience, the most important thing of a leader, in my view. Coming to BT, it sort of epitomizes the real difficulty you have when you're running or chairman of a very large company like BT. We have multiple different stakeholders. As you've said, it's not just your shareholders. If from 800,000 to 900,000 are individual employees who have a particular view and a closeness, an affection or a frustration with the company. You have some institutional long shareholders who are looking for dividend income. You have some short shareholders who are looking for other things. So you've got that, and it's quite a complex group to manage. At the same time, you've got you're unionized for 70% of your workforce, including the management. You have regulatory restrictions on what you can do in relation to Openreach, which is another layer of regulation and issue. You have Ofcom regulating you. who, not to be too unkind, because I think everyone would admit it now, pursued for too long a policy of regulation, of restricting price increases, and really taking the view, which was never the case, that BT was some kind of monopoly, but actually mitted it against the ability to invest, was what actually happened, including for other parties, which slowed everything up. You've then got a pension, 50 billion pension, with a technical deficit of about 10 billion, with all the issues of the pension regulator, who actually under a lot of lobbying by the CBI and BT and other of the big companies is trying to adjust this. The purpose of the pension regulator, for example, should not be just to make sure it's solvent, because one of the ways you make sure it's solvent is make sure the company survives. So, you ask for too much too soon. So that was changed. But again, you had that equation to deal with. And then, frankly, quite apart, you have the government, because the government takes a real interest. And you have security responsibilities and restrictions, some of which are known and some which aren't known. And so you have this combination of groups, and you have to know, how do you manage all of this, as well as the political element. And it is very complex, and it is very difficult, and it does restrain, and BT's had a series of excellent chief executives, actually, and it is very difficult to get this moving with this complexity. It does need courage. I mean, I personally think you've really got to engage as it is. You've got to engage with the politicians, with the opposition, by the way, to make sure people understand the issues. You've got to communicate internally. You've got to try and communicate with your shareholders. And frankly, sometimes you have to put your head above the parapet and say what it is in very simple terms, what the truth is about why things are happening or not happening.
Because if you look at things today, isn't it? I mean, absolutely understand the complexity you're talking about there, and getting your head above the parapet, something that you've often done. But why is it, Mike, do you think that increasingly, if anything, business leaders are not doing that so much unless they feel there's a big tide behind a movement? I mean, you touched on Brexit. Hardly any business leader really spoke out, frankly, on either side about that. The CBI, I mean, you were president of the CBI and spoke out a lot now. I think occasionally Tony Danker is out there, but why are people feeling? Is it social media that constrains them? Why are people more constrained, and how should they deal with that particular sense of public discourse?
No, it's exactly right. And look, this is Chatham House rules, I guess, because these things are quite sensitive. Yeah. But over a long period of time, and it isn't just the recent government or the last 6 years, but ever since we introduced the role of special advisors and others, the fact is that you speak out too much and you get those phone calls telling you to shut up. I mean, that's what happens in a polite way. You get a lot of pressure. And boards feel deeply concerned sometimes about what happens if you're chairman or chief executive. You shouldn't be political. And that's right, you shouldn't be political. But there is a way to do it. I always forget which section of the Companies Act it is, whether it's 167 or 172.
172.
172. Yeah, but you actually have a responsibility to speak out. And, and I think there are times you really have to do this and not do it in a political way, but just say, these are the economic issues that we're facing. We tried to do this on Brexit, The board at BT, when I was there, were very supportive, and we decided to write to all of our employees on Brexit. And that was, I think, we're probably the only ones who did, or maybe there were one other. And we just took the view that we actually had 100,000 people. We had a responsibility to explain to them what we thought the issues were. That didn't mean to say that they wouldn't decide that they still wanted to vote Brexit if the idea of sovereignty was their definition of sovereignty or belief. But actually, what happened, just it's worth briefly saying. So there was a lot of concern about this, and we took the view that morally we had the right, we had a right and an obligation. We're a big part in BT of society, and what happened, we had a right, we had an obligation to speak out, and we did. And also we felt the arguments in some boards you can't do that. We said, no, actually if you want to make that argument with the lawyers under Companies Act 172, we believe we have a right there, if not an obligation. And then so we sent a letter out to 100,000 people, and then they asked me would I do a town hall with I said, absolutely, fantastic, great. And then they explained to me they were going to have, I think it was 20 security guards, to protect me from, which made me feel a bit like an American president or something, but seemed bloody ridiculous. And it was interesting. We probably had, probably 2,000 people in the auditorium who came from a cross-section. And the first person said, Mike, why did you write the letter? So I explained why we wrote the letter. You know, we felt it was important. We felt we put the facts out. We've tried to do it in an unmotivated way. We're not telling you how to vote. And you know what? I mean, and I just said it, right, and they started to clap in the audience. And then the next person said, Mike, how can we speed up fibre rollout? So there was no issue with the employees. So sometimes speaking to people the truth and feeling that you're saying the truth as you see it, it's not a bad thing. And I think sometimes you've got to be willing to do that. You know?
And do you think, for example, the climate crisis is an area where business needs to do more of that? Because if you look at what happened, you know, in Egypt with the COP summit, I mean, clearly there's, you know, it's more difficult now to get implementation. Yet often business is part of the solution. I mean, but there's not so many voices. There's counter voices, but there's so many positive voices about positive change.
Yes, I mean, my sense is there's been much more overt, you know, support for the climate change agenda, but be able to speak out. And one of the things that was really disturbing about many others about Trump was his attitude to, you know, denial on climate. What I thought was really impressive about the American business community, they really said, no, you know what, we have to deal with this climate issue. It is an issue for the climate. It is an issue for our customers. It is an issue for our employees. So I actually think that has been easier. You know, Prince William's been his father, I mean, King Charles gets a lot of flack, you know, but he's been one person who has always put his head above the parapet on things like this climate change, as has Prince William, you know, now. And I think that's a better example than some of the economic issues which have become very complex. And you know this in this room. I mean, there's I've never known the level of frustration in the business community as there is now, you know, with the ineptitude of the government in the last, well, frankly, the last 6 years. I mean, let's face it. I mean, in the last 6 years, we've been brought to our knees, this country, reputationally and economically. That's the truth. Now, you can argue why that is. It was the implementation or this or that. That's the truth. We've done permanent damage to our reputation through this 6-week government. We just look incredibly stupid, and we've got to build back trust. And I think business leaders have a role to play in that. I mean, they do, to be fair to the CBI. I mean, I was president of the CBI. When you do get some of these phone calls, you know, you keep saying these kind of things, you know what, we're not going to talk to you at all. And then you won't have any members. Because actually, what I try to explain to people, the importance of the CBI, which is a very high quality, and it's not the only one, British Chambers of Commerce and others, you know, International Chamber. But, you know, the important thing is really having the private connection to the Prime Minister's office, to the Chancellor, to the Business Secretary, to the Environmental Secretary. And often there's really, really good engagement there. And you've got to keep that going. But your members expect you, because they feel, many of them, they can't put their head above the parapet, or it's too politically risky, or their boards don't want them to, or they get into trouble on, I don't know, just the reputational side of it. They expect the CBI, for example, to speak out on these things. So you're on a tightrope in relation to the way these things operate.
Well, I'm glad, by the way, that when I was a special advisor in government, that you and I had different sorts of conversations. But I think it reflects an important point, by the way, which is, as it were, more and more people in the political class are more and more distant from the business community for good reasons. They haven't been in it. And actually, it's one of the things I was shocked about when I was in government is that, I mean, both amongst the advisory group and amongst officials and amongst ministers, when you got down to specific issues, there were very few people who got it. And therefore, I wonder the extent to which one can, through leadership, encourage some people within your organisations to get more involved, not necessarily politically, but with any government to help them. I mean, I remember when there was an issue about would Ellesmere Port be closed, the production of cars, and I remember going to luckily this is Chatham House, a big meeting, and I suddenly realised that the whole strategy was wrong because nobody got the point that the decision was, plenty of people absolutely get the point here, the decision was not going to be made in the UK. The decision was going to be made in America. And therefore the critical thing was, could you fly the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Deputy Prime Minister or Business Secretary to the board meeting to make that point? And you should see people's faces when that point was made. There was a sense that so how does leadership encourage as it were, voices that get it to be round the table? Because if you don't get voices to get it round the table, surprise, surprise, decisions are often wrong.
Look, I mean, it is a question of engagement. You know, the Cameron years we had, and Nick Clegg, we had the Prime Minister's Business Advisory, on which I was on for about 5 years. That wasn't going to solve all the problems by any, because, you know, you had 15 egos sitting around the table. So, you know, but it did have a value. You could connect, bring things in, make points. I think, unfortunately, at the moment, I mean, the business community, I mean, it's generalization, because there are exceptions to this, feel the government just hasn't been listening and is not interested. But I can tell you, I mean, Charles, that, for example, you know, while Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor, there was very, very good connectivity between the CBI and other business groups and the Chancellor. So you need that. There was a time when, you know, a lot of civil servants would come and spend time in business on secondment.
Yes.
That's a very good thing for them, for their development and so on. There was a time, you know, I don't even know we've got one, and it didn't work very well, where business people came into government civil service, you know, for short, as a, you know, business secretary. We had, you know, a number of those. Ian Livingstone was one, for example.
Mervyn Davis came in.
Mervyn Davis was one. Stephen Green from HSBC was one.
Yeah.
Stephen actually stayed 3 years, because generally they haven't stayed very long. But no, you need that connectivity, because there is a, I don't know, I guess everyone's always said this, but it feels particularly at the moment, people really feel it, that I know in business and engagement, I don't know, there's a level of incompetence on top of the ideology and the arrogance that permeates not all, but some sections of the government, which is deeply, deeply, you know, corrosive, I would say. And I don't think it's a real issue. I mean, we've made these one decision after another. Look at storage of gas, 2017. The government refused to pay the amount for strategic gas reserves, so the Rough facility was closed down for sake of 30 million quid. Now, you know, there hasn't been a long-term energy policy. There is not a long-term healthcare policy. There is not a long-term defence policy. There is not a long-term education policy. All of this is coming home to roost as we try and deal with our low levels of productivity and low levels of investment. And this is really the moment to turn it around to the point of the slides, that I think business leaders have really got to speak out, because this is only going to be solved by business leaders. But the politicians have got to create a more honest, open, transparent, factual environment, because the situation is really serious. And privately, I mean, even the majority of people who were most adamant about Brexit, you know, including my local MP, kind of apologised to me. But I mean, their view is slightly different. Oh, well, you know, it was worth it anyhow because of sovereignty, fundamentally. Their interpretation of what sovereignty meant, but that it's all been done wrong. Fine, but let's at least say it's wrong. And then we got a chance to fix it by pragmatic, not, you know, we don't have an opposition. I mean, instead of just saying we're not going to join the European, we're not going to rejoin, so we're not going to, we're not. Why is it somebody opposes this? This is what we need to do, you know, to recognize the issues and then do something about it. And then to bring business with you, give them the right incentives on investment to get this productivity conundrum dealt with, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, we've got the biggest trade deficit since, I think it's since 1956 because of our export collapse. So, I mean, people wonder why the pound was going down.
So given your experience around the world, Mike, because obviously you've chaired businesses globally and you're still very active in you know, very powerful markets, the Middle East and the States and Europe. I mean, what lessons from other countries can we draw? What are we missing here that other countries are doing better? I mean, or are other countries not doing better? Where's the lessons to be drawn here?
Look, I think the US and the UK have some of the similar problems of education and so on and so forth and infrastructure, but they have an even more dynamic economy than we do. I mean, I lived for 14 years in continental Europe, and as you may guess, it was a pro-European, and for me, it's not just an economic; it's a social and cultural issue as well. You know, it's a big issue for me, you know, in terms of what Europe should be, peace in our time and all these things. But one thing they do have, whether one likes it or not, proportional representation really diminishes the power of a small group of extremists to take control of the direction of the country. And they have to have longer-term policies on education. I mean, no one thinks that this private discussion on education, no one thinks of sending their children to private school in Europe unless you're traveling, unless you have to, because all the schools are good. You know, you don't have so much private healthcare. Why not? Because the hospitals work. You know, they have infrastructure, they invested, they have much longer term policy. And it's about proportional representation, which the Lib Dems obviously agree in. So it's long-term thinking, whether we like it or not, and whether we like all of the outcomes or not, what's the advantage of a dictatorial communist system? It's long-term strategy. Now, you could argue we're heading a difficult period because, personally, I think it's a big shame that Xi has done away with the term limits, because Deng Xiaoping, the most important thing he ever did was we're not going to have the cult of personality and we're going to limit it to 10 years, which it's a good, I mean, most of the big professional partnerships actually have these rules of limiting the senior partner term, and it's a very good rule. But it's that long-term thinking. And if you combine long-term thinking with the problems we do get in some public companies on short-term quarterly reporting, you know, that it's a pretty bad combination if you've got no long-term plans and you've got too much short-term pressure. And I'm doing quite a lot of private equity. I've done quite a lot of private equity, and the reason is that you'll know this, many of you. I mean, it's you know, you can really make it's not an unlimited investment horizon, but instead of saying how are we going to keep the shareholders happy for the next 3 months, the next 6 months, you're actually thinking, you know what, we got a 3-year plan here. What are we going to, you know, we're going to make this company better, you know, and that's what's happened. I mean, I did the private equity oversight group a few years ago, and when we did the work, then the political noise stopped completely. It was the Labour government who asked me to sort of chair this group on how does it work, and actually what was very clear, the majority, not all obviously, was this investment led to much better companies, much more employment generating, much more taxes, with high levels of debt, yes, which allowed some people to make an awful lot of money, but the outcome were better companies through longer term thinking. I'm not saying that's the answer to everything, but there's something here about, on the political side, long-term policy, and the government companies being able to think long-term.
Yeah. So sometimes those, and you've done a number of those roles, you were the first chair of the Skills Commission, business in the community. So linking all those things, I mean, what you're saying to us, and I obviously saw this when we worked very closely together, Mike, is that actually getting out and about is fundamental to the role, whether you're in a private partnership, whether in a public company, whether in private equity. I mean, what you're saying, and one that came up there, the role of the business leader in public discourse is really important. I mean, you're pushing that very hard today. And are you saying that if you if you were looking at yourself, would you have thought that, or did you grow into that because of how the world was and the challenges that were coming?
I don't know. I mean, I think to some extent, I mean, interesting. I left England in 1974 when we were the sick man. I only had one out. I mean, the only reason I became an accountant, by the way, was to leave the country. I didn't see it as a career at all. I just thought, when I looked at what was available, I thought the countries I mean, it really was the sick man of Europe. And a lot of people I knew, we just thought, how do we get out of the country? And I looked, well, I need some kind of qualification, to get out, because we weren't in the European Union, blah, blah, blah. And that's why I became an accountant. The moment I qualified, I left. And I was gone for 17 years, 14 years in Europe and 3 years in the Middle East. I mean, I was supposed to go, I qualified here and then I left. And I was supposed to go for 2 years. Either I forgot or they forgot or something. But, I don't know what happened. But I think culturally, I saw so many different things. When I came back to the London office, what was Pete Marley called KPMG shortly thereafter, I mean, it struck me that things in the UK were not. We were going through a golden era for sure. We'd entered the European Union. Margaret Thatcher had really re-incentivized people, which is important. I think she did some. People love to hate her, and you may have guessed I'm not a Tory, but I thought she did. Some really important things, and it felt like there was something there. But still, you could sense there was a way that things. There was a certain insularity in the city, I felt, notwithstanding a certain arrogance, which is less today in business because so many people came in, learned their trade, and we see Goldman's moving. I mean, we're losing a lot of people now, some for good reason, by the way, actually, and some not so good reason, people moving out to the continent. So I think that insularity, a little bit of British exceptionalism, which seemed a little bit to me strange. So it made me feel that there are other different ways of doing things. And working, I try to get people to understand, working in an international firm, you have to work with people. This working, and we have this the benefit and the curse of English. it's a huge benefit, but it's a curse. Because I was trying to get people, you need to tell me how it is when you've given a lecture or a speech in a language that's not your mother tongue. You know, when you go to a meeting, think how when you're speaking really, really quickly, how many people are going to pick up, or you give them the chance to speak, or you understand. So these nuances of the things that we had historically made me think that, you know, we need to not be so exceptionalism. And I think we went through a real period when that drifted away, when, you know, London was a magnet because it was a magnet. People came to train, they went back home, you know, blah, blah, blah. Then we had unfortunately, the financial crisis, which there were huge issues at stake there, including regulation, by the way. But yeah, I mean, it's those kind of things that I think
got you into the public discourse as well. Look, let's broaden out to the audience now. I mean, I can't be asking all the questions. There's such a fantastic group of people who would like to. Yes, gentleman in the back. If you say who you are, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much.
I could even see you now, which is even better. Brilliant.
Thank you very much. It's Quentin Cowdery from Libero Consulting.
Quentin.
So, Michael, just 2 quick points. You said almost as an aside, a very interesting aside, that the leadership quality you particularly valued was resilience. I think I heard you correctly. I certainly was very struck by that. I thought you might have said vision, for example, strategic thinking, resilience. I'd love to hear a bit more on that, why you think that's so important. Secondly, I can't help feeling that your comment about the very poor relationship between business and government at the moment, I can understand why Brexit is such an important issue for you at the moment, but I just think there's a touch of historical myopia there. I mean, I can remember back in the 1970s, I think you almost said it, we were known as the sick man of Europe. So I think it's very easy to lose perspective when you're talking about relationships and making analysis.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I think I said resilience and values, which are, you know, really critically important, which are 2 aspects of leadership that people absolutely need. Obviously, you need, and I think it's more than vision, you need as a leader to develop purpose. Purpose is really important. I mean, it's a much better word, I think. What's the purpose? You've got to have a purpose and, you know, a line. You know, remember, I mean, again, Chatham House rules, we had lots and lots of discussions about this question. Against a negative regulatory environment, you know, and shareholder pressure not to invest in fibre, but just to increase the dividends. We had a lot of board meetings, you know, and the board there was fantastic. And we came to the conclusion, you know what we're going to do? This is so complicated because we pressure from the government. We've got some issues which are our own fault. Customer service is not what it should be. So the postbacks filled. Everyone criticises us. The regulator don't give us any slack. The first investments we make, they're not even giving us the fair return, blah, 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 blah. You know what? It's time to just do the right thing for the country. And if we do the right thing for the country, we'll do the right thing for ourselves. You know? But that will take time. And it took time. And a lot of shareholders said, Mike, you know, you're doing the right thing, but we'll just wait till it turns around. So the share, you know, when you make those decisions, they have consequences. So I do think purpose, you know, but I don't think people looked as, you've got to have resilience, because otherwise you won't survive. And you've got to have a high sense of values, as we've seen, not just in business circles, but if you have political leaders who don't have values, then you see what happens. We've seen it only too clearly, and not just in this country, but elsewhere. So that would be my answer. No, I don't really. I mean, I think that, you know, we have to be realistic that history, in my view, sort of does tend to repeat itself in every cycle, be it politically, militarily, as we're seeing, you know, in Europe, sadly, again. But also, I think in business cycles too, people don't seem to learn lessons. I mean, so there is a bit of that. I mean, if you look at the cryptocurrency debacle, I mean, it's just incredible. I mean, we've been talking about it for, you know, they're regulating the hell out of the banks and doing this ring fencing, which was always a nonsense, and they admitted it. But it's taken 8 years. They've now announced that we're going to start to do something about ring fencing, which didn't solve any problems and created unintended consequences of high house prices and lack of use of money for investment. But, you know, it is, you know, there is that sort of cycle of things, you know, that just repeat themselves. You've got to try and, you know, that we should have learned the lesson from financial. We look at these LDIs, the LDIs, and this is incredible. The stress testing on the LDIs, which should have caught it, was just at 100 basis points. Now, when I was at Barclays, we were stress test on everything. To believe that you could go on gilts to go only 100 basis points, and on the way people were leveraging LDIs to deal with defined benefit pension schemes, and have a stress test on it. Just think about it. I mean, it's ridiculous. So we keep making mistakes. That's absolutely right.
So who wants to have the second question? Yes, gentleman there. Gentleman there. Yeah, I'll just wait for the mic. The mic is just, yeah, please.
Michael Watrous, I'm with Straightline. I'm one of your speakers actually later, but question to you, Sir Michael. So The Economist about, 4 or 5 weeks ago had an article titled, "Britain Hasn't a Clue." Has no clue. So, and it talked about some of the points you made, no long-term planning. Where's Britain going to be in 2 to 3 years?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, Britain, look, I'm British, and I'm proud to be British.
I'm half British, just
Yeah, okay. I have an Irish passport as well, thank you to my mother, which gives me some ease of travel. But no, look, why I'm so frustrated at the moment, and many businesses are, is we want to move forward. We want to build on what we have, great universities, great technical skills, Formula One, many things, design. We do many things incredibly well, on university students, but we're in danger. I think the frustration is people, including some of the opposition, it's really depressing, think, well, we've just got to wait, it's 2 years and this and that. We need this government, to really grasp the realities of what's happening right now and really move forward apolitically, not be ruled by 45 ERG members.
You're right.
Because we can do it, and we want business will get behind this and get positive. The frustration is what's the first reaction to the immigration figures, which are completely misrepresented in a way by the press, is we're going to cut back on students. I mean, one of the things we've really got going for us is student activity, universities developing startup, the things that really make in a country with bad demographics, So, this is the real bloody frustration. We haven't got, in my view, 2 years to wait for a Labour or a Labour Lib or for a new Conservative government based on One Nation Tories, the more reasonable group. And I don't know, to some extent, if business speaks out loudly enough, in a coordinated fashion, sector by sector. I mean, have you seen the charts on what we've done on motor car? I mean, so this. One sees the charts on motor car manufacturing.
Yeah.
Yes, a big chunk of it is chips.
Yeah.
Okay, but a very big chunk of it is something
I'm
else.
waiting for a chip, actually. 6 weeks my car's been sitting at the dealer. Yeah.
Waiting for a chip.
Yeah.
But it is that, but it's more than that. It's how many, hundred thousands, they say, of businesses have had to cut exports to Europe because you simply cannot do the red tape. People like BT, the people in BT love to have more regulation in the organization because they can have more people to do with it and et cetera, et cetera. But, when you're a growing company, this is a real burden. I mean, hopefully it'll gradually get better and so on and so forth. So that's my frustration. We don't have 2 years to hang around for the next government. So you just got to hope that Rishi Sunak, who's obviously a man of integrity and ability and capability, but not much experience, we need him to succeed, actually.
Well, you've got inflation at over 11%. The pound, as you said earlier, Goldman Sachs predicts the pound will be at parity at some point in the first quarter. So, I mean, these are pretty scary.
It's very
signs.
scary.
Yeah.
And the productivity conundrum. I mean, when I was the Commissioner of Employment Skills, just one last fact, other people, but it's interesting. I mean, when I was Commissioner of Employment Skills, we recognized there was something, and I may have this the wrong way around, and it was a very good group because it was across the whole of the United Kingdom. We had the unions in there as well, president of TUC, so it was really open. We had small, medium, big size. It was an interesting group. We did a lot of research at a staff, and one of the figures we had, I think it was 5 million people were illiterate, and 7 million adults were not numerate. And 34% of graduates were not going into graduate employment. Same figure, by the way, the US had at that time. Charlie Mayfield took over from me, that group. Charlie, built on it. And he told me when the government closed it down because it was providing facts that were inconvenient, he told me by the time it went, there'd be still we had 7 and 5 million adults. And you talk to people, from the Midlands about trying to retrain people when they've got no numeracy or literacy, no improvement. And now 50% of graduates are going to non-graduate employment. So it's part of the productivity conundrum. You know, we're trying to build apprenticeship. Many of you will know, I mean, and the apprenticeship levy was not well thought through. Okay, they're trying to correct it now, but you know, this is a real problem, our productivity. The French can have 40% employers' social security and still produce a car cheaper than us with higher wages.
So another question, yes, gentleman in the front, and I'll just add a couple of points while we're getting the mic there. I mean, Mike, absolutely true. I mean, it's still the case that 1 in 6 households in this country don't have a single book in the house. And it's absolutely the case. I know this because I'm a trustee of the National Literacy Trust. Second point, in the poorest areas in the country, there'd been over 10 years of some progress on attainment with maths and English GCSEs. That was wiped out because of the pandemic. Why? Because the people who struggle most come from often very poor households who, surprise, surprise, don't have the access to phones and computers. And my niece, who teaches in a very mixed area of Croydon, she said that during the pandemic, a quarter of her students she couldn't make any contact with at all. So these, as Mike said, needs a long-term solution and real activity, which business is a crucial part. Yes, sorry, next question, gentleman there.
Oh, hi, Jan Dowman.
Jan, please.
Yeah, hi.
Nice to see you.
So, Michael, you put the blame for the mess, nearly all the blame, on the government and successive governments. So, question though, realizing that government may or may not, probably won't improve much, surely there's more onus on business itself to take the lead. On things like productivity, for example, there's limited, I mean, the government can do something. So at the end, it's individual companies, isn't it, that can do more. And I'm just thinking about maybe some more collective action by the big companies who are really affected in a major way by the mess, in areas like education and health and other major societal issues, to take it on themselves more proactively to do much more than they're doing. What is your feeling on that?
So, I mean, absolutely. So a few things. One is I don't just blame the government, actually. I blame elements of the press who for 40 years misled the public in a serious way. I blame, much as I'm a big admirer of David Cameron. I thought the Cameron and Nick Clegg government, I was there, blah, blah, blah. I went with him to Scotland a couple of times on the Scottish independence referendum. He made a massive mistake up front, which we tried the first ever referendum here, I think it was 1979, Scottish referendum, required a 65% turnout, but it required 40% of the electorate to vote to leave. Why on earth, Prime Minister, did you not do that? Would you not do that? If they'd done that on precedent, we would not have been leaving, because actually only 37% of the electorate voted. We had an irreversible constitutional change based on 37% of the electorate on what, if it had been a company, a prospectus would led the directors to at least being banned from practice, if not worse. Moving on from there, the right-wing press who supported that are culpable enormously. But you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that, I'm shocked for example, I don't know a business who doesn't care about his people. I think there's more care about the people than seems to happen in political circles, frankly speaking. I don't know a company that isn't committed, whether things are the Prince of Wales has then led and developed on looking after our people, commitment to communities. And people do it because your young employees expect you to do it, and people get to mentoring. So there's enormous amount is going on, by the way, and you need to do even more at a time like this to work in the communities, develop on education, mentoring, literacy, numeracy, can make a real difference in local schools, and many companies have that. But I do think that there is, to your point, some kind of need for all the major, and they began to do this. So the CBI, the BCC, the Federation of Small Business, the International Chamber of Commerce, and anyone else, the Motor Car Manufacturers Association, who warned the government specifically which factories would close if they left the EU. And They all virtually have, or will. And the government have had to fork out today, I think, £600 million to rescue Ford production of electric vehicles, as BMW have moved to China, as they said they would, as Honda closed down completely in Swindon, as they said they would have to, losing 8,000 good, well-paid jobs and the supply chains involved. So somebody has to stand up and start saying, guys, what's this about? And if it's coordinated, you don't have this sort of political divide and rule, if you will, But I agree.
Well, Mike, look, thank you so much. You were my boss for 10 years, so I know that you've never been someone who misses a public platform and the opportunity to make clear your views, and also to make clear, as that last question from Jan brought out, the contribution that business needs to make, not just by voice, but by actions, including, as you've shown in your career, in the most disadvantaged communities, to help people have opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have. So on the behalf of this audience, I'd like to lead applause to thank you very much for your time. Pleasure. And your insights as ever. Mike Wright.
The aspect of the responsibility of leaders and the care, particularly of leaders. I'm delighted now to welcome our next series of speakers with Andrew White and Chris Woolard. I'm delighted to welcome you both to the stage. A little bit of background about Andrew. Again, you have both our speakers' bio on the program. Andrew is our advisory board member. He's also a wonderful client we very much enjoyed working with at the FCA when he was head of communications. And what's not on Andrew's bio, in addition to all the amazing roles he's had in public service in this country, is also that Andrew is going to be starting as chief executive of the Association of Financial Mutuals. Make sure I get that right. So Andrew, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Chris Woolard, thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, and good afternoon, everyone. As Sandra says, my name's Andrew White, and I'm proud to be a member of the ECHO Advisory Board, and I'm going to be kind of talking to Chris Woolard about some of the challenges of regulation, which we've already heard is a kind of a theme that's emerging in some of the research that ECHO's been doing. Chris is a great person to talk about this because he is chair of the EY Global Regulatory Network. He leads EY's EMEA and UK Financial Services regulation practice and their UK fintech work. But before he joined EY last year and brought in that expertise of regulation, he had a 25-year career in UK public service, including a large chunk in regulation and regulatory roles. He held senior roles at the BBC's then regulator, the BBC Trust, before going on to Ofcom, the media and communications regulator, which Mike has clearly got views about, before joining the FCA Financial Conduct Authority in 2013. At the FCA, Chris served as Executive Director of Strategy and Competition, a member of the FCA's board, and crucially and pertinently for some of our discussions this afternoon, as Interim Chief Executive during the first phase of the pandemic in 2020. And full disclosure, a little bit like Neil's just done, Chris was my boss at the FCA, but since he no longer does my annual appraisals, I promise to go easy on the brown nosing. One of the themes of this conference is about, well, the theme of the conference is about balancing conflicting priorities in the face of change. And that's particularly relevant for regulation. And as I say, in Sandra's eloquent introduction, we saw regulation emerging as a theme on people's agendas at the moment. And of course, the last few years have been characterised by change, the most dramatic of which was the pandemic. So I'm going to start with that and start to talk to Chris a bit about our experience of regulating through the pandemic. And Chris, I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back, what's nearly 3 years now. Andrew Bailey, who Sandra name-checked earlier, was appointed as Governor of the Bank of England in December 2019. You were appointed as interim CEO about a month later, in late January. And meanwhile, in China, the world was starting to change. You formally took up your post on the 16th of March. As a comms director, I knew all these dates, by the way, I've done. And the first lockdown began on the 23rd of March. So it was pretty clear very early on that this wasn't going to be the usual tenure of an interim CEO. But I just want to ask you, when did you identify, once you'd taken up the post, that regulatory interventions by the FCA would become part of the wider, the non-health, if you like. That was the front line, but we at the FCA were involved in this wider response across society to the pandemic. And when did you recognise that? What were some of the triggers that made you realise that was what we were going to have to intervene in that way?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I think it's fair to say the planning for what we were about to go into at the start of the pandemic started sort of really around the time I'd actually was announced as being appointed, and simultaneously with the news that was coming out of China. And perhaps predictably, where we were working with government and where we were working with others, you immediately go for the tools that you know. So government very much planning around a health emergency, lots of organisations, including the FCA, bearing in mind we had 4,000 people working for the organisation, thinking about how are we going to cope with very large numbers of people who may be sick. And a lot of that internal planning really around how do we keep operating at a time where we balance those things. So how do we split teams and so on and so forth. For us as a financial regulator, also starting to plan around the idea that we could have a very, very large economic shock to the economy that was very difficult to predict, and therefore very large numbers of insolvencies, for example. So we started to pull out of the bag the kinds of tools that financial regulators have used in previous economic shocks. But I think very, very rapidly, and certainly actually the week I took up post, it really kind of snapped home to me, getting a call just before midnight from my sort of European level opposite number, saying that a number of stock exchanges across Europe were starting to think about suspending in the next 24 hours because of the uncertainty and because of the volatility. And that's not an uncommon phenomenon. It's not something that we're used to much in the UK. The idea of suspending the LSE would be a very big event indeed, but on many of the smaller sort of bourses across Europe, that is a fairly common regulatory tactic. But just being confronted by the sheer numbers who were thinking about this really begins to tell you this is something very, very different that you're dealing with. And at that point, we still weren't into an official sense of lockdown, but it was becoming very, very clear that this is going to be unlike anything really any series of societies had dealt with before. And so I think you're forced to then start to regulate in very different ways. I mean, the first is you have to have a massive dose of pragmatism. If we're looking at a world in which most of the operations that we know are suddenly going to try and start to work from home, which we all take for granted now, but at the time that was really completely untested. Everyone had a disaster recovery based on one or two buildings maybe being bombed or something, but not an entire economy going to work from home. How do you make that operate? How do you think about recordings and all the things that financial regulators require? Secondly, just the sheer scale of who was going to get hit. Think about millions of people unable to afford their mortgages. And in the middle of a pandemic where staying at home with a roof over your head was incredibly important. And so you end up in a mode where you've got to think of those solutions very, very quickly. And I think there's a couple of things that regulators will look for, and certainly I felt very, very conscious about. So, I mean, I think the first of those was the way in which we work had to change very rapidly. So for those of you used to dealing with financial regulators, if you want something done, it's about a 9-month cycle. We go out, we consult, we possibly change rules, we then expect people to implement them. And instead, we move to a mode of working where those kind of rule changes were achieved sometimes in sort of 2 or 3 days. The way of doing that often was to get the CEOs of major banks or major insurers all on the phone together very quickly, regroup within 24 hours, look at what the art of the possible might be. And probably the biggest early change we obviously had was the mortgage rules. So 5 million people got to stay in their homes because they could renegotiate their mortgage automatically, effectively. But then also, I suppose, one final thing is the expectations on the regulators at that point, and the expectations on the official sector, if you like, at that point, is although lots of people are willing to do the right thing, although business as a whole wants to help at that moment, they also want to know there's a bit of a level playing field. They do want some leadership. The Treasury, in our case, could absolutely not deal with everything. And so you have to construct a narrative, which really is, and given this is a communications conference after all, you absolutely have to construct a narrative at that point to try to explain to people what's going on. And although no one knows how this is going to play out medically, we have to be able to give people something to aim for. So we had this idea of we're creating a bridge, and all of our actions are geared around trying to create this bridge from one side of an emergency to the other. And that became something that I think a lot of people clung to as a narrative far more than I expected they would, which began to give us the basis of a way forward.
Building on that a bit, the FCA has a number of statutory responsibilities, consumer protection, market integrity, and promoting competition in the interest of consumers. There are some commentators who see, again, the theme of the day, if not a conflict, then at least a tension between these three objectives. Faced with those challenges that you've just outlined, how did you go about, what approach did you take to balance those different priorities? What did you think about getting that right balance right?
I think if you take the bridge analogy that we used, as I said, a lot of that is about saying, look, we want to be able to preserve as much of the market and avoid as much of the economic damage as we possibly can from the situation we're going into to the one we help try and take people out of. And I think in that world, although you might take a range of very different actions, they do speak to all of those priorities ultimately. So in asking, for example, banks to do things largely voluntarily, frankly, about how they treated their mortgage borrowers, that might be seen as a consumer protection measure, and it absolutely was. But it was also about how, when things improve here, and how as people go back to work, particularly if they're self-employed, as the economy begins to recover, how do you make that as least disruptive to the business model of those institutions as you possibly can? And so how do you think about market integrity in those situations? And the reality is, certainly in the first month of the crisis, all sorts of things that you took for granted about the operation of financial markets started to come out the woodwork as being broken. I remember one Sunday afternoon having to try and fix how we think financial reporting is going to work in a pandemic, or otherwise on Monday morning there was a whole series of results due for financial firms where all the auditors could do was qualify the accounts because they couldn't get onto the premises, et cetera, et cetera. And talking about that now, it sounds trivial in some respects, but the effects on those companies in what was a very volatile environment would have been really serious and probably have done them some lasting damage, or at least some medium-term damage, which was completely avoidable. But you have to be prepared, I think, just to be incredibly pragmatic when you're in that situation and you are there on behalf of the official sector as a whole.
So, recognising that was a kind of a unique situation, well, let's hope it's a unique situation anyway. But when you look back on that time, are there any wider lessons, and particularly in the context of your current role with that global overview you have, are there any wider lessons about the role of regulation and the practical implementation of regulatory policy which could apply outside a pandemic context? And maybe even picking up some of the things that Mike was talking about a few moments ago, things we could think about applying in terms of dealing with the current situation, and particularly things like the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, the two things really, I think, come out of that for me. I know you're always meant to have a list of three. Apologies, Khaled. But two really big lessons from that situation for me. The first is, I think often the dialogue between regulators and those they regulate, and indeed the consumer groups who represent those who use the products that are being regulated, is often very stylised. And it's often very stylised for good reason. There are lots of legal rules around how you consult and all of those sorts of things. But I think often you can have quite a sort of atrophied kind of conversation going on, which follows certain rules and follows certain conventions. Whereas actually during the pandemic, I think we had meetings where real work was being done between all the different parties. We have a problem, how are we going to solve it? And I think quite often regulators feel forced to come to the table saying, we have a problem, we've also worked out what we think the solution is, now tell us if that solution doesn't work. That starts the conversation in a very, very different place rather than a more open dialogue. And then the second piece for me is the degree to which, just building on that first point, often the need is to come forward with a solution rather than necessarily calling out the problem. And I think on something like cost of living, being really explicit about, look, these are the issues we need to try and solve for, rather than simply, I've got a bunch of answers, I'm taking some action, how could, job done, I think is really, really important. But I think back to actually a point that Mike was making, I think the interaction, particularly with the press around that, is really difficult, even for regulators, because you're the regulator, who's been arrested, what change in policy is about to happen, what action's been taken. That's what people want to hear, as opposed to saying, look, we're in the middle of something that is genuinely complex, and this is going to need a whole series of different parties to try and make it work. That just sounds like I'm kicking the can down the road, and it's how do you change some of that dialogue?
Okay, thanks. I'm going to move on from the pandemic now and look at some of the kind of current issues. I mean, particularly the growth agenda, which has been on everybody's lips. I mean, it's a commonplace amongst some commentators that regulation is antithetical to, or at least a brake on, competitiveness and growth, and especially innovation. We heard that a lot, I think, as Mike has hinted at earlier, since Brexit, especially in recent months, in the kind of post-summer period. And only last week, the Prime Minister, in his speech at the CBI conference, highlighted the importance of innovation as the key to growth as he saw it. Interestingly, though, I think some of ECHO's own research shows that actually a well-regulated market is actually trusted both by consumers and indeed by investors. And I think you've only got to look at crypto in the current topical example and healthcare in Africa to see where there are issues around that. And as for innovation, I think it's widely accepted that the UK's regulatory environment has contributed to its global lead in fintech. And sparing your blushes, probably more than anyone, you drove and shaped the regulatory framework for fintech in the early part of the last decade. Can you tell us what you saw as the opportunity, and how you went about striking that balance in terms of innovation and growth, but also making sure those other objectives of the FCA's were met?
That's firstly very kind of you to say it that way. I mean, I think it's a lesson here. So back to actually something Mike said earlier on. He said, look, history repeats itself. So rather than talk about cutting-edge cryptography and all those sort of things for a second, let's just go back to the England of Alfred the Great. Okay? Vikings invading, the world's in chaos, the country's in ruins. And what Alfred actually did was establish the system of burhs. So where most of our towns to this day exist, they exist on the site of ancient burhs. And this has got a point to it, by the way. Bear with me. Right? In those burhs, you had the only person ever named in a medieval document of the time who wasn't a lord or wasn't a king. And that was a person called the Portreeve. And the Portreeve was basically what we take nowadays as regulators and government all rolled into one person. And he made sure that the walls were safe, that the Vikings couldn't get over them. He made sure that inside only the market could be held there. If you went to the market, you got fair measure. And he also made sure that the taxes were connected for the king, so he could raise an army and beat the Vikings in that world. Right? And if you go around the world, if you go to China 2,000 years earlier, virtually the same rules and laws written down. Exactly the same purpose. And this idea of you create somewhere where there's a market, where it's got some rules around it, where you get treated fairly if you're a customer of that market, and ultimately the state benefits in the form of taxation from that market and then applies it to whatever the big issues of the day are. Hundreds of examples like that all around the world. And yet somehow, I think in the modern political dialogue, we've completely forgotten that lesson. And so when you approach potential growth, I mean, I think regulation can have a really, really important role. And that's about giving customers that certainty and that protection and that confidence to engage in something that is potentially new and not well understood. That's the first piece. Second piece is, without that competition, we know that markets become stale and settled. They tend towards monopoly. There's a lack of competition between players. Even if there isn't that monopoly, why is it in anyone's interest to rock the boat and do something new if everybody is doing well from that market? And again, we see that repeated across the world in different economic patterns. And so the idea really from, that we struck out with the FCA was to say, let's try and get around that problem in a couple of ways. The first is we're concentrating only on innovation that is in the interest of consumers. There's a lot of innovation that happens in financial markets that is in no one's interest except the innovators, and that is not good. That always ends in tears. The second thing is, how do you create a space where, and it's quite unusual actually, and so if you think about modern regulation, you think about modern sort of political dialogue, you create a space where people can actually try and fail safely. And that's what the whole concept around the regulator having a sandbox was about. Come in 6 months, you can trial a product, you can actually do it out there in the real world. That model's now been copied in over 50 countries around the world. The UK was the first to do it. And the big benefit is clearly you get innovation that clearly is meant to be out there in the market and will actually give a useful product, an economically useful product to society. But it also has some really interesting side benefits, which is if you're one of those fintechs, if you're one of those innovative firms and you've been through that process, guess what? Kel surprise. It is far, far easier for them to get venture capital funding, private equity funding, because they can go to the market and say, look, I've got something here. It's a model that's tried and tested. And I think all too often we think of regulation as simply holding things back. And that's often because I think the dialogue around it is the dialogue between the big incumbents who are very happy to keep things the way they are and the government and the regulators, and where new regulation is seen as unhelpful, versus actually where it can bring new people into the market. But the one final thing I would say, and this is some of Mike's earlier criticisms of regulators, there is an element of truth to this as well. I mean, regulation can be a great force for good. It can also completely stifle things, and it can have unintended consequences. And so it's how do you keep that wider dialogue going? How do you keep your ears open as a regulator about how you might need to change things and when you don't, frankly, get it right?
So it's a good point just to move on a bit from that think about keeping your eyes and ears open as a regulator. The context of today's discussion, which set out so eloquently by Sandra earlier on, is about the kind of seismic changes of the last few years and their kind of ripple effect forward. We're thinking about things like the economic recovery after the pandemic, the cost of living crisis we've already mentioned, the ESG agenda, which is driven in large by to a large degree, at least, by the whole kind of global challenge of climate change, and especially in the last few months, the quite extraordinary geopolitical situation that we're living through at the moment. All of this creates an incredibly volatile, uncertain and complex environment for all of us, regulators included. You now sit chairing the EY Global Practice with this overview globally of regulation and regulatory policy. What do you think is going to happen in the context of that to regulation and regulatory policy and regulatory practice?
I think that probably is the more than $1 million question, but for me, there are three things that I think are going to shape how that regulatory landscape looks over the next few years. I mean, the first is the geopolitical piece you've already mentioned, but I'll come back to that in a second. I think the second theme is data and digitisation, and in particular, how do regulators begin to react to that? And then I think the third big piece is ESG, and in particular, how do the climate pieces and the green financing pieces of that manifest themselves. But I think on the geopolitical piece, I mean, I think everyone can very quickly and rapidly point at what's happened in Ukraine, the tensions around Taiwan between the US and China, and the much deeper tensions between the US and China. And then I think you can go on to the next level beyond that. You can talk about grain supply, from Russia and Ukraine into sub-Saharan Africa. You can think about, some of the other knock-on effects if, we do see disruption in the Gulf in terms of oil supply, where suddenly I think the US will begin to understand some of the inflationary pressures around energy that Europe's already experienced. So you can get all of those sort of things. But I think the interesting piece from my perspective, and certainly from the clients that I deal with, is what are the knock-on consequences? So I think there's a couple of things. I mean, the first is regulation has always been fragmented. Even though bodies like IOSCO and the FSB exist in financial services, or there are other UN-sponsored bodies in other parts of the world, the reality is the big trading blocks around the world tend to set a version of their own rules and always have done. I think what we're seeing, though, at the moment is a much deeper phenomenon around that. So not just accounting rules in the US that are very clearly targeted at China, but if you look at India, their data rules, which are really more about how do they build an independent financial sector separate to China, but have all sorts of knock-on consequences. So, firms like American Express and MasterCard really running foul of that approach. And even, bluntly, within countries. I mean, in the US, the policies that are being adopted by some states, so say California versus Texas, are very, very different. And then you get the market reaction to that. So, one of the things I think we can all see is people strategically not decoupling from China, not that far, but actually a sense of their strategies towards China cooling a bit. I think many firms are now having to say we've survived for years by being sort of neutral about politics, and actually we're being increasingly forced at national level to pick a side. And does that mean now, instead of being in 40 or 50 countries around the world, we can only really successfully be, say, in 20 or 30? And I think those decisions are starting to become real. On the data and the digitisation piece, I think even if some regulators around the world tried to get as close to the edge of this as they could, the reality is regulation is playing catch up, and there are all sorts of considerations around artificial intelligence, around ethics, where I think there's a whole series of things to come that firms need to begin to plan for now. And then finally, on the ESG piece, there's a lot of conversation about this. I think in reality, certainly again, if I look into our client base, maybe 50% of firms max have really begun to engage with the commerciality of it, as opposed to the positioning of it. And I think how that begins to manifest itself, and how in particular, is it a climate-led conversation, or is it, certainly in the financial world, a more finance-led conversation? So how do we deal with things like transition finance, where you've got polluting industries today, and are they going to be funded as green because they're moving to a much greener future? Those kind of dividing issues mean that I think that point is really all still to play for there. And again, I think how regulators begin to approach this, and certainly at the moment it still feels very, very fragmented, is going to have a massive effect on the market, and in particular, where does the US go within that? So 3 big things. There are lots of others, but I think 3 big things that really will shape how we all think about regulation in the future.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think that's a good point to open to the floor. Right, hands up straight away. So just straight here. Yes, in the second row. Yes, you. Yeah, the mic's coming down now. So say who you are and ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cindy Yendall from Leonardo Advisory, Culture Change Business. Christopher, I was really interested to listen to how you responded, or how your team responded during the pandemic to the crisis, and the fact that actually you became very purposeful. There seemed a really immediate purpose, which Mike was talking about earlier, which is super important. And the fact that you changed the way that you were working quite quickly overnight. So collaborating with the banks, building teams of trust, making decisions really quickly, being really productive. That's what I heard you saying. And a lot of my clients behaved the same way during that crisis. Many of them have slipped back to old ways of working. And actually, so my question to you is twofold, really. Is one, did you hold on to some of those new ways of working? Because essentially that was about a shift in culture, a shift in the way that you worked with stakeholders. So did you hold on to much of that really positive new ways of working, or did you slip back? And yes, that's my question, really.
Okay. So, I mean, I think there's two parts to that story, internally and externally. So I didn't really sort of talk about it much in my answer previously, but I mean, internally we did change very, very rapidly. So you need to be in a situation, and I think many firms experience this, where you shorten dramatically your internal lines of communication. So one of the things I started to do almost by accident was a weekly newsletter. I wrote it, Andrew sadly didn't write it. I mean, I literally wrote it myself. It was what I wanted to say to the organisation internally and try to create the similar sort of bridge narrative for the people inside the organisation. In terms of our formal decision making, we had a sort of crisis group, which was not just our exco, but some of the other directors as well, to give our teams far more chance in an uncertain world of knowing enough to make their own decisions quickly on the ground rather than everything being referred up. And I think certainly that latter piece, and certainly the weekly communication, I held on to once we were still feeling like we could catch our breath. I think there's other things where you begin to slip back a little bit. I mean, you know, that amazing rapid decision making, and I can remember a particularly terrible moment where it was 3 a.m. and we were announcing to the market at 7 a.m. the next day and getting to a decision and then going, Andrew, can you write a press release? You know, here we go. Not many people want to keep working like that, and it's not sustainable. So you do slip back in slightly older ways. But I hope, you know, certainly during my tenure, and, you know, I had to step down after 6 months because Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor at the time, decided it was going to be someone else other than me. But I hope during my tenure we kept some of that. But I do think it's very easy and comfortable to be able to say, right, we're out of crisis, let's all relax. How do we used to do this stuff? And I think that is a real temptation to slip back into that space.
So down here, I think.
Kai Peters from Coventry University. Christopher, some years ago, I went to see, I think it was the FSA before it was the FCA, and I was asking how it worked and how many inspectors there were and how many players in the market there were. And people were telling me, oh, we're doing stuff in teams now, but the ratio didn't strike me as very good. So I was asking whether data and tech was being used properly by regulators. And were they using big data and artificial intelligence and tracking social media opinions on the payday lender or the mortgage provider? And I got looked at like I was coming from the moon. And I'd just be interested in your view on whether regulators are actually up to date on stuff they're supposed to be using or regulating, as it were.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll comment on sort of my day, as it were, and then sort of the last couple of years in terms of what I can observe more globally. So one of the things we absolutely did, and I wrote, I think it was the FCA's first data strategy, was how do you harness some of the things you've just talked about? So how do we use social media on a consistent basis to actually monitor what we think customers are getting? How do we use some very large data sets to spot outliers? And we began to do that from a supervisory point of view. I mean, during this crisis period, you know, no one had experienced trying to shut down pretty much every economy in the world before. And so, I mean, it did feel, there are various analogies that people use. Some people said it was like Captain Cook getting past Malaysia and then not having a chart, or, you know, flying a plane without the instruments working or whatever it might be. And we did have to find proxies very, very quickly, both in the FCA and the Bank of England. And so there were things we were using that came absolutely from big data. So, you know, Google, it turns out, is an absolutely fantastic way of getting analytics on traffic information. We were using spending data and spending pattern changes from most of the large car providers and things like that, where actually you can see a pattern of how a country goes into a lockdown and how people's habits change, and essentially they're the same anywhere in the world. And the fact that there were some countries ahead of the UK became an incredibly important tool for us, because, you know, we could kind of see what was happening to them and say, we're probably going to be at that stage of the curve in 4 weeks' time. But yeah, I mean, since then, I think the FCA's doubled down on that wider data strategy, and I think we'll hopefully see some proof of that. I think when you go around the world, it varies considerably. So, jurisdictions like Singapore, I think, are incredibly advanced about how they're using some of these tools. The US regulators are getting there, but often hampered by the fact that their own internal boundaries mean they're very fragmented about how they think about big data. And then I think there's some, certainly from an EY perspective, we're part of some very interesting experiments that are happening in different parts of the Far East and different parts of the Middle East, for example. So I think regulators are getting there is probably the short answer. But, there's an awful lot of space and ground to still try and cover.
One more question, I think. Just there, thanks.
Charles Tilley, the IRCC. Christopher, if we just stick with the UK rather than the global piece, and Mike was talking about the regulators getting in the way of innovation, but your story on King Alfred and the Vikings, which I thought was brilliant, was very much about regulation being a builder of trust, and therefore very important in terms of the market. Where are we today in the UK in terms of where's the dead wood, if you like, and what's getting in the way of innovation, or is it all perfect?
No. So look, I mean, if I talk about this maybe from my perspective at EY for a second, I mean, there are bits of the system that are not working well at the moment. So the system by which we authorise new companies to come into the market, new individuals to be senior individuals, that for a variety of reasons seems to have been very, very seriously challenged in the last 2 years. And therefore, that creates a significant delay for new business and innovation in the market. The regulators are still clearly grappling with some of the effects of Brexit that we've already touched on earlier on, from a very practical point of view. So how do you facilitate firms doing cross-border business? How do you reauthorise many of the people who have previously been in the UK under EU passports for firms and those sorts of things? So there's some really practical sort of sludgy things going on. There is a fine line, I think, to walk on trust, and I often got confronted with this as a regulator, which is the industry saying, well, you keep fining us and you keep giving us bad PR. If only you didn't fine us and we didn't have the bad PR, then people would trust us. And I think that's I'm only slightly paraphrasing. Trust, I think, for most people. I mean, Mark Carney once said, it arrives on foot and it departs in a Ferrari. But trust really is about giving people the sense of, certainly in financial services, I can borrow money here, I can invest money here, I can do all the things I need to do to survive as an individual financially, and that if something goes wrong, I know there is a system that will look after me, essentially. I mean, I think that's really where trust comes down to. And so it is about how firms tackle that head on. I think that the Consumer Duty in the UK is causing a whole series of firms to think really, really deeply and fundamentally how do they deal particularly with all new retail consumers. I think that's really, really important. I think, though, regulation also, to some extent, has taken a slightly more cautious path in recent years and does need to think about, where it takes a risk. I mean, I think a lot of the work we did around the sandbox and a lot of the work that we did around fintech in the early days was a risk, because we knew something would go wrong at some point, and it would go wrong with a regulator's label on it at that point. It's far easier if you're a regulator to sort of put the walls up, as you've seen in a number of countries, not engage and just say it's the Wild West over there. And I think crypto's the very best example of saying it's the Wild West over there. And I think one of the questions, really, I think if we want further innovation in financial markets, and its innovation in the interest of consumers, is how far do we want the UK to be ahead of a number of other countries in sort of reaching into that space, and how far are we sort of happy to kind of stay back in the pack? And, that's decisions for others these days rather than obviously me.
Chris, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time for that session, but thank you for that kind of toured our eyes on of regulation, starting with, you know, one of the most acute crises that a regulator could ever face, and the details of how we dealt with it, how we responded to it under your leadership, through to your kind of overview of the global trends and the global patterns and the pressures that are on regulators, not just in the UK, but around the world, all of which fits very neatly and segues into the presentation that Sandra gave us earlier on about some of the challenges we're facing. So it's been a really excellent way to take the discussion forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you again, Chris and Andrew. We were particularly privileged at ECHO to work to support the FCA, Chris, during your tenure, and could see the change and could feel the change and be able to actually say how well the FCA had done from so many points of view. So really, really wonderful story, very true, and interesting to see how agile one can be when one needs to be. And not lose sight of that. So we've talked about resilience, we've talked about trust, we've talked about purpose. I think now it's time to talk about tea and coffee and cupcakes done by the head of our content and global social listening team, Melissa Davis, who's here, and she's made lovingly individual cupcakes for all of you outside with tea and coffee. Please be back here by, I would say, soon after 4:25, because we'll start promptly at 4:30. Thank you all, and thank you again, Chris and Andrew. We're looking at what are some of the practical solutions and things that we should be thinking about with some wonderful case studies and examples. So in the first instance, I'm delighted to welcome Michael Watrous in conversation with Joe Osborne. I know, Michael, you'll introduce Joe in a moment, both fresh back from the US, one from Thanksgiving and the other from a business meeting. And Joe, I have to mention this, just landed this morning, had a shower, jumped in. I don't think you've slept, but just delighted that you're with us. So thank you both, looking forward to your session. And two things about Michael. Again, you'll see his bio on the QR code, but Michael is one of the world's leading experts on branding and brand design and brand engagement, so we're going to hear about that. And the other thing you might not know is he is really the true maverick at the US Air Force. So with that, welcome.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Sandra. Yes, I was a fighter pilot. That was like a million years ago. And I have 6,000 hours. Someone asked me that just the other day, so it's quite a few hours. And then one little anecdote about flying, and this you'll find quite shocking. You'll probably never get on an airplane again. This was just published. I get the Airline Pilots magazine as an ex-pilot. 68% of pilots globally don't know how to fly a plane manually. Think about that next time you fly. So the FAA in America is going to force pilots to learn how to fly manually. I knew how to fly manually. Anyway, I'm the CEO of Straightline, and we're a global strategic brand agency. We work everywhere. We're working for Syngenta in China, and in Switzerland, ABB. We're working for Wallbox in Spain. We're working for several British companies. We've worked for Lloyds Bank, for Hikma, Walgreens Boots. We did the Merger brand. And we worked with Joe at Reckitt. And we worked on the brand strategy that led to the new identity and the new naming and the new Reckitt. So on that, I'll introduce Joe. And Joe is amazing and a client who really understands brand. So, hi, Joe.
Hi, Michael.
You're still awake.
I'm definitely still awake. Whoever made the cupcakes, thank you. The sugar has helped no end. It was absolutely delicious. And also, thank you for telling your plane story today and not yesterday, because that may have been the thing that tipped me over the edge. So Michael and I had the pleasure to meet each other about 5 years ago when I had just joined Reckitt. You can see my current employer on the screen behind us. We're not going to be talking today about who we're currently working for and with, but we will be using the time to reflect a little bit on some of the branding perspectives that we've worked on together, but also some of the branding perspectives that we often debate when we have the pleasure to get together. So huge thanks to Sandra for inviting us to converse here rather than as we normally do. 25 minutes on brand, a specialist subject, is shouldn't be too hard a lift.
Not too hard. Well, let's start with what everyone's been talking about before us. I mean, the world is literally falling apart. So we've got a war in the Ukraine. We've got the pandemic, and incidentally, I was shocked in this morning's Telegraph. 700 people a week are still dying in the UK of COVID. I don't know if anyone read that today. I mean, we've kind of moved on mentally, we want to put it behind us, but it's still a huge issue and something we have to think about. And all of this, the pandemic, the war, the economy, inflation, just everything affects the corporate brand. And the corporate brand is under so much pressure today. And it's really the safe harbor, as we say, but it's under tremendous pressure because of all of these things. And an example is we're working for Hitachi. And Hitachi's had to move people out of the Ukraine. They've had to move thousands of people out of Russia. They have facilities in these places. And so there's all these logistical things that go around the war that's going on and how it's affecting inflation here, the energy issues, and all of the other things. So on all of that, Joe, that's pretty, not pretty good news, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the permacrisis thing, it's a big word, right? It's a big word, and it sums up what we're all feeling. And I think, Sandra, your charts at the beginning, it really struck me when you're asking people, what are you doing? And a lot of people are working on action plans. We're going to work on an action plan to do this, and an action plan to do that. And then when you ask them, okay, what are you really concerned about? What you're concerned about is ESG. What you're concerned about is perception. What you're concerned about is attracting and retaining talent. And actually, as we were listening to the fascinating discussions earlier about the implications of the permacrisis, I think we were talking about this earlier, that one of the things that the permacrisis does, in essence, is it gives an opportunity for those who are really prepared to double down on the work of corporate brand, and that your corporate brand, in that sense, can be a balloon of hope in a time when the permacrisis does feel all-pervading.
Yes. You have to remember that the corporate brand touches every stakeholder group. I mean, if you're a privately held company, that's a whole different kettle of fish. But let's stay on the companies that are listed on the exchanges around the globe. So you're talking about employees, you're talking about investors, partners, you're talking about Wall Street, the media. You've got a host of folks that somehow, one way or another, touch the corporate brand. And in my view, and I think Joe might agree to this, the most important stakeholder is the employee. I mean, at the end of the day, they carry the flag. And I can tell a quick story, maybe.
Go ahead.
We worked on the British Airways brand years ago when Lord King was alive, if some of you remember him. He was quite an icon, big cigar smoker. And we met and we started to work on the brand. And I said to him, Lord King, we need to go talk to some of your employees. And he blew a big puff of smoke and he said, you don't talk to my employees. We tell them what to do. Wow. So I wasn't buying that. I said, no, we're going to go talk to them. So anyway, we got permission to do that from David Burnside, who was his communications lead at the time. And we went and talked to, 150 employees. But the key here was I had to convince him. So I said to him, well, Lord King, let's say you're going on a flight. You go in, you check in. Somebody checks you in, right? Yeah. Yeah, they do. And if you're flying first class, they're going to put you in the lounge and serve you a cup of tea and maybe a drink. And then you're going to get on the plane. Someone's going to serve you. Someone's flying the plane. You're going to get to the other side. You're going to get your baggage. And he looked at me and he said, go talk to our employees. So they're a key stakeholder. Wouldn't you think so, Joe?
Yeah, I think also one of the things that you see, depending on the industry, is that sometimes your employees can really surprise you.
Yeah.
I remember working in oil and gas for GE many years ago, and I'd just arrived at the company. I'd come in from pharmaceuticals, and I did what in Italian you call il giro delle sette chiese, the tour of the 7 churches,
Yeah.
and you ask, tell me what we do around here, what's important, etc., etc. And everybody talked to me about productivity for the benefit of the customer financial gain, which is a very worthy proposition for a business, but quite difficult as a rallying cry.
Yeah.
And that's what I was looking for. I was looking for something on which I could hang my hat and ask people to do the same, because brands are built from the inside out.
Yes.
There was a quote I used to use until about a month ago when I got told it absolutely isn't true. But apparently there was a presentation I saw many years ago from Star Trek. I'm no Trekkie. But it said that Captain Kirk apparently once said, if you want to reach the stars, you first have to get all your people on board.
Yes.
I've since been approached by somebody who's very much into Star Trek and has said that absolutely never happened. You need a new quote, and that's not the case. But the principle remains true. And when we asked people who spent their lives soldering metal and filing blades, we asked them to tell us in their own words, what did they think they were doing? What it generated was hundreds of thousands of touch points of content. And the purpose statement we ended up then using as our brand rallying cry across everything internally and externally wasn't really to do with consumer or customer productivity. It was, we fuel the future. We push the boundaries of technology to bring energy to the world.
Yeah.
And when you're filing your piece of metal, that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're bringing energy to the world. You're pushing the boundaries. Much more human, much more relatable. So oftentimes, I think really tapping into that employee audience as the place for your brand promise is incredibly, incredibly rich, and surprising how little it still happens.
I agree. But, the corporate brand is often confused. The healthcare industry is probably the biggest confused group of all the silos that we work in. Years and years and years, we branded the Schering-Plough Global rebrand, big pharmaceutical firm back in the day. I remember saying to the number 2 person in the company, not Fred Hassan, who was running it, but the number 2, that we need to really dig deep and do all of this work. And his response was, well, can't we just have a nice logo? And wouldn't that do it? And it was always about product. And his point was, who cares about the corporation? It's really about the next blockbuster product. And that was that went on for years in the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry, about the product. Well, the product isn't really the corporate brand. They're very different. The products are often run by the marketing groups within an organization. The corporate brand is owned by either a brand leader, what Joe was at Reckitt, or a chief communications officer. But in the case of ABB, we worked with right up to the CEO. We often work in the C-suite, where these I always say the chief executive is the steward of the brand. While they're in that particular position, they own the brand. And what they do with the brand and how they manage the brand, look, we did the Tyco rebrand. Anybody remember Tyco? The $6 million shower curtain. The CEO spent something like $40 million of the company money redoing his home. Well, he went to prison for 14 years. We come in, And the new CEO, Tom Lynch, says, we can't live with the name Tyco. Well, obviously that name was dead in the water. So the corporate brand is really the face of the company. It's everything it represents. It can be good or it can be bad. And in today's world, you can destroy a corporate brand in a millisecond. One mistake. And I always tell our CEOs to be honest, forthright, and tell the story the way it is. And I know that was the case at Reckitt.
Yeah, it was. And you know, I think this idea about the all-pervading nature of the corporate brand is also really important. You know, we had a great fortune at Reckitt in that we had a new CEO. It was a particular moment in time for the business, but what it enabled us to do was to really start from the foundations. You know, there's a small part of my soul dies anytime anybody asks me to work on a brand by starting with the logo.
Yeah.
And, you know, what we were able to do at Reckitt was we were able to say, let's go right back and say, now that we're at this new, we've reached an inflection point as a company. We've got a clear business strategy moving forward. What do we want our value set to be? Let's go back to understanding what is the core of the company.
Yeah.
What is the value set? What are the leadership behaviors that we want to have? What is the purpose, and how can we generate that with people from inside the company and with stakeholder research and everything else? What do the customers say? What do the consumers say? What do the partners say? What's the fight? What's the rallying cry? What are we all combining towards? And we did all of that first before we even got anywhere near talking about the colour set or everything else. But I think one of the other things that really is for me a differential, and this idea of the brand as a safe harbour, is when you don't pigeonhole it. You still do hear, I think sometimes you must hear this more than me, well, you know, the corporate brand is for our stakeholders, is for our shareholders.
Right.
And then the product brands are for our consumers.
Right.
And then the employer brand is for the people that we're bringing in. But what you do with that is you dilute the impact with every stakeholder group, course. Right? And how can you really, starting from the essence of who you are, who you want to be, who do you serve, create a corporate brand platform that you can then ladder up and down across the audience groups.
Perfectly said.
And then that is what gives you the safe harbour.
They wind up competing with one another.
Right.
You have the employee brand competing with the corporate brand, with the product brand. I remember when we did the Walgreens Boots Alliance brand, I was shocked. We came in there and they had, well, I didn't know they had 700 companies. 700 businesses. Businesses that the person we were reporting to, Ornella Barra, was the COO of the company. And we were in a meeting and we showed her a matrix of all the brands they owned. And she didn't know, well, we own Liz Earle. Liz Earle's a place where women go for spa treatments, that sort of thing. There's one right here off the King's Road. And she didn't even know. They had no idea. And then we found out they had something like 500 websites. They had, I mean, it was all over the place. And that's a problem, that the companies don't know how to bring the brand together and give it a central purpose, a central story, a central set of messaging. So you have all these various groups. And we found this out with ABB on their brand. They had people in India, in China, doing their own corporate identity, doing the ABB logo in blue, and all of these things that really fights against the whole purpose of what the brand is and what it's meant to stand for, what its message is, what its vision is, that's what we do, and that's what most companies, unfortunately, to this day, still make that mistake.
And I think it's even more important now that social media is such an important part of our engagement, right? Whoever you are, whichever business you're in, that the advocacy that your own employees can do on your behalf is a way to cut through with authenticity. And as long as their lived experience on a day-to-day basis is authentic to the brand promise that you're telling people, you know, how are you using your brand ambitions, your purpose, your fight, your principles, whatever your corporate lexicon might be, to make decisions that impact. You know, I know companies were doing it through COVID, looking at when we didn't have a North Star. We did. The North Star was the brand and the ingredients of the brand. And so you have a decision set. You make those decisions. You put them on one side. You look at the corporate framework on the other, and you say, if this is the promise, are we going far enough?
Right.
And in some cases, the answer was no. And in some cases, people did things differently as a result. What that enables you to do is to have a very authentic swathe of advocates on your behalf.
No question. And social media puts pressure on the corporate brand, because if you don't tell your story will be told on social media. And then how do you manage that process? And again, I'm often surprised by some of the companies we work for. We work for very large global companies. We're a global company, and we have offices in Asia and, of course, here in New York. But I'm always surprised about how little our clients know about social media. And it's sort of, oh, do we really have to do that? Do we really have to get involved in it? It sounds like a pain in the neck. Well, you know what? You better get into it. And the world of digital and the world of social media is here to stay. And how it's managed and how you manage it within the corporate brand is key. Wouldn't you say, Joe?
I would, and I think, you know, if you want to see how a corporate brand can play out on social media in a way you may not enjoy, Twitter, maybe is a compelling and current example.
Do you know, I have so much respect for Elon Musk, because look, you can say what you want about him, but it's people like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and people who are out of the box, and, you know, SpaceX, and some of the things, his accomplishments have been staggering. I think he made a big mistake here. And I think he knows he's made a big mistake. I mean, he overpaid. He's managing it. He's micromanaging it. And I have a feeling, I'd been asked, I had a reporter here call me and ask me about what I thought about the Twitter brand. And I said, I think the Twitter brand could be destroyed. It's very fragile at the moment, and the news is all negative. And I think this could be an issue or case where Elon Musk doesn't succeed. I mean, I wish him well, but I think that that brand might be very damaged at this point. Might not be able to fix Twitter. I just don't know. So it's not good news on old Elon's. But, you know, he didn't put up most of the money. So I think people like the Qatari Trust and J.P. Morgan and others are probably more worried than Elon is.
Having some sobering days. But I think it's also been interesting as the backlash has obviously played out in social media, because where else was it going to play out? What you also do perceive is how much sense of belonging there was from the employee base to the former iteration of Twitter. So I think it's fascinating from a branding perspective, because you're actually seeing both sides of the coin play out at the same time.
Yes. You know, people ask me all the time, what should we do to manage the brand? We're not there for life. We come in, we stay with a client as long as it takes, but eventually they need to carry on. And I tell them to be true to the brand and to always be honest about the stories they tell and the mission and how they get that voice out to their various stakeholders. And it's a shame that every once in a while or every month you pick up the newspaper or something on the net and you read something stupid about a big company that made another stupid mistake about how they talk about their brand. And I just wonder what some of these CEOs are thinking. I speak quite a bit at various CEO functions, and I spoke at a Goldman Sachs one, and a number of CEOs were there, and they, afterwards, in the reception, a few of them said to me, well, is the corporate brand that important? Isn't it really about making money? I said, yeah, it's good to make money. We all want to make money. But no, the corporate brand is it is the glue. It is really the glue of the corporation. It is everything about the corporation. It's everything it represents, and you hope that it represents good things. And I would also ask you this question, Joe. We're in a world today where it's so important for companies to give back.
Yeah.
And I know that you did at Reckitt, but talk on that subject. It's not just about making money, but isn't it really about giving back and being a responsible citizen?
I don't think there's a choice. I mean, my own school of thought is that I don't think there's ever really been a choice. But I think now it's more commonly held, the view that there isn't a choice. And, if you look at things that have happened in the corporate code, particularly in the UK, which has been leading the way on this stuff, we need to think about ESG and some of the declarations. It's in the company code now. Yeah. So even for the laggards, you've got to do something.
Yeah.
But actually, when you think about this moment of perma-crisis, you need to get innovators coming in, right? The corporate brand is the glue. It's also the magnet.
Yeah.
Who are you bringing in to innovate with you?
Yeah.
Who are you bringing in to partner for your supply chain? How are you competing for the very best talent in the marketplace? And actually, there is choice. And in a world in which we've all been working from home a lot more, there's a lot of debate going on around that, which will take us down a rabbit hole we don't have time to get into today. Right. But the competition in some cases doesn't have geographical boundaries anymore.
Yeah.
That means that the best companies, if they want to be the best and fulfill their corporate ambitions, that best is not just about financial returns. Yes, we want companies that are doing solid business, because the more they do, the more they can give back as
exactly.
well. But who you really are, I think, has to be part and parcel, and that is not just about words. It is about actions.
Yeah, no question. And I would say that you think about the corporate brand and think about the long picture here. It's something that you constantly nurture, and as the world changes, you change with it. And you'll see brands change by look. Typically, a brand is refreshed anywhere between 5 and 7 years if you average them out. But it's not the refresh so much in the look, it's what's behind that really is so key. It's what is that message? What is that voice that you hear? And I think that, again, being honest, being forthright, and telling the truth, because it's so easy today to get caught. You can get caught in a second, and then you spend your time digging out of that hole, and all you've done is created damage to your brand. So it's quite easy today brands are very fragile. You have to be very careful about how the corporate brand is managed and nurtured. And I feel privileged that we're in that space and have worked on some of the leading brands all over the globe. And it's been fun working with you, Joe. I enjoy it.
Right back at you, Michael. I don't know whether anybody, I suspect we could chat all day, but I don't know whether anyone else has any questions. We might have time for a couple. Oh, good.
We got a few there.
Lovely.
Hold on, we're getting the microphone here.
Thanks. Ollie Arbour from Helmet. Thanks for that really interesting discussion. I was really struck by the language used, not only the title of the talk, but some of the words you used about safe harbour, being a steward of the brand, that the brands are quite fragile. Do you think, especially given today's turbulent world, that we should actually set sail from the safe harbour and use brands more actively? Thinking about Patagonia, for instance, how they've, certainly the founders, given away the company to a non-profit, his own non-profit. Do you think we should be more activist and more purposeful with our brands?
Well, maybe I can give you my opinion. Jo could give you hers. I think Patagonia is an unusual case. You had a founder that from day one, I met him actually at a conference years ago, who had this mission in mind. He knew from day one he was going to do this. I mean, an incredible company. Everything about them is amazing. I don't think the Patagonia works or fits with most companies. You take a company like Hitachi, who we're working for. They have various divisions from energy to rail. I mean, if you've ridden the London Underground, many of the cars are made by Hitachi. They're in digital and so many other areas. They make consumer goods. But to take your point, I think it's something you should strive for. I think giving back honorably, being a good corporate citizen is very key. Can you go as far as Patagonia went? I don't think you can, because you have different stakeholder groups on most corporations. And of course, they're a retailer, if you will, and many companies are not in the retail space. So it becomes a little more complex, but the concept of Patagonia is brilliant. And I would love to see corporations give more.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I don't know. I think don't underestimate what it means to be a safe harbor in a time when all the sea is turbulent and there's sharks in it. I think being a safe harbor is already quite a stretch goal for a lot of things. But I think, you know, there used to be a commonly held belief that if you were the brand manager, that the corporate brand manager, so the corporate brand is your job. No, that's my title. It's everybody's job, that's got to start with the CEO. And I think if you take the essence of what Patagonia did, they did the thing that was quintessentially Patagonia, and used it to reinforce their brand with authenticity. I think there is a lesson in that for all of us, to be a bit more courageous and a bit more hands-on when it comes to the corporate brand. I don't think we'll see too many other people giving away lock, stock and barrel the whole company. But the essence, I think there's something in that.
Yeah, there is, for sure.
Maybe Musk will give away Twitter, you never know.
This gentleman here? Oh.
I've got the mic. Win Fanshawe of Capture the Event. You were both quite passionate and forward in brands giving back, giving something back. And, you know, fingers crossed we're heading out of a pandemic. There's been a huge amount of loss of life, obesity, physical inactivity, mental health, et cetera, and that's huge. I was very surprised in Sandra's first chart that there was no direct reference to health and well-being. It was buried somewhere in ESG. ESG is such an easy excuse now. Yes, we're doing ESG. From what you were saying about giving something back, why do you think chief executives have not flagged that up at this stage? And I don't mean internal, improve health and well-being. I mean external. Giving something back, making communities in which brands operate a better place.
Well, actually, some companies are doing that. We're working, as one small example, we're working for a company called Village MD. Now, some of you may have heard of them. They just did a huge merger with a New York-based company called CityMD. It's one of these places where you can go on the high street and you don't have to have insurance and you see a doctor, and it costs $20 to see. So they have 600 such facilities, and now with the merger they're going to have over 1,000. And we're working with them on the brand strategy. They're doing just that. They're in the healthcare space now. They have doctors and they have nurses and so on. So they're building within these communities facilities as part of their brand where people can come and learn about nutrition, how to eat better. You talk about obesity, how to live better, how to exercise. They have programs. These are free. They're on the high street. You walk in, they give you a schedule. On Tuesday, you can do Pilates. On Thursday. So Now, but it is a very, very rare occurrence, in my opinion. And your point is well made. I think more companies can be doing more of this at a larger scale. And I think it's very inexpensive to do it as well.
And the example you just quoted, would you say that their brand value has gone up?
Tremendously. Now, they have other issues right now. They're in the middle of a merger, so the news is sort of getting foggy with the merger. It's all very positive, but so it's kind of gone down here a little bit, but we're going to help them raise that visibility, if you will. But I'd love to see more companies be doing that. I think it's particularly in today's environment, where so many people are, the new normal is a lot of people are still working at home, for example. So wouldn't it be nice to get out of the house and maybe be able to go somewhere and be part of this? So yeah, I think it's a great idea. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Sandra, are we okay to carry on? Yeah, one more question, Sandra says.
Yes, that was really, really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Question this concept of giving back. Giving back is fine, but you make it sound like that's philanthropy, right? And where I think, from my experience at least, reputation is about how you implement your core business, is how you integrate ESG into everything you do, irrespective of what you give away. And giving back is kind of, we'll carry on doing business as usual and we'll give something back. And I think that that's maybe a way of really getting away from the core message. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about that. I have one rallying cry for you, Joe. I must tell you this. Right, I was doing some work, 15 years ago in America with a bunch of American companies who were concerned with why the Japanese were always winning.
Right.
And they wanted my company to do some benchmarking. And so I went off to Japan and had a great time. I went into Toshiba and managing director went round. She took me to the working floor in a factory, everybody dressed in white and everything else, and there were signs every few meters on the walls, and of course they were in Japanese, so I couldn't understand. So I said, well, what are these signs? Oh, Jan, he said, it's quite simple. It says, kill Hitachi.
Well, I'm working with Hitachi, and they're quite well alive.
That was motivating everybody on the factory floor to benchmark themselves against their main competitor. It wasn't bad. It worked quite well.
Well, they should probably read Simon Sinek's Infinite Game. He would have a very different point of view on that. It's worth a read if you haven't. On your point of giving away versus giving back, if it came across that way, then that's an error. I think it is really about understanding the philosophy of giving back as a core part of your business. So how do you really make sure that you embed your purpose and your values, and that you are thinking about your contribution with and connection to the communities in which you work and operate, whether that's sourcing, whether that's your community engagement. It's also philanthropy where you can, but I think it's really important to underline that it absolutely needs to start with your core business and the way that you go about your core business. The point well made.
More. Absolutely.
Well,
thank you.
Sandra?
There was one additional question. I don't know if there was a question there. Perhaps we can just squeeze one last one in, and then we'll go on
your
to our
call.
next.
Hi, it's Miranda from PwC. I was just interested in hearing your opinion on, historically brands, I mean, it really does depend on the brand, but brands might have held back on commenting on certain issues that were in the public domain and kind of held back. With now that there's such, I guess, a pressure on brands to now have a stance on things, yet there can be a tension there because while consumers or the general public might be demanding a company to have a stance on a particular issue, another stakeholder might have a completely opposing view. And what we're finding, certainly as we're talking to clients, is that there are really polarizing opinions now. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, my opinion as the consultant, and we'll get Joe's opinion in a second, but my opinion is that corporations should speak with one voice, and that one voice should represent all of its entire body. From the products to the employees to the services, and everything they do should have one voice, and that one voice comes out of the corporate brand. And it serves all stakeholders. And yes, there will be sensitivity. The financial community may not like a particular comment or story that's being told. Employees may not like something they hear. The bottom line is you're never going to make everyone happy. There are too many stakeholders within the corporation today, too many people that have a stake in the business. And I keep telling our CEOs, speak with one voice, the entire organization. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, for sure on one voice, Michael, absolutely. I think there's a lot of pressure for people to comment, particularly, LinkedIn. The CEO's already posted on LinkedIn, and that CEO's already posted on LinkedIn, and that's kind of exhausting. I think you really have to look again back to the foundations of your corporate brand and map out ahead of time what are the things that you care about authentically internally, and be clear about then. Don't be sort of press ganged into making a stance because other people are making a stance. At the same time, I think this is also often where employee advocacy comes in. Because there may be things or moments in time when, in the name of sort of the galactic mothership, you don't want to come out with the corporate tweet and say X. But if authentically, internally, your employees, your other stakeholders, your partners, know that you are doing activity in a certain area, what you will find is that story, that positioning will come out on your behalf. So. I think it's dangerous to play the somebody said something, so we must. I think you always need to be authentic, and I think it's also a really good opportunity to look and see what other credible voices are there that in an authentic way could help to articulate the message without it having to be a corporate diktat.
I totally agree.
Thank you. On that note, thank you. And now to bring us on to our final session, really to say, how can we thrive? I'm delighted to invite our last two speakers of the day, the inimitable and highly energetic and inspiring Anne Frank, who is head of the Chartered Institute of Management. If you don't know about it, I'm sure we'll hear more, and ways of engaging with the Institute. And also Kai Peters, Professor Kai Peters, who is the provost at I'm going to get that wrong, isn't it? Yes, at Coventry University for Business and Law and also International Development, and is an author and expert on leadership as well. So delighted to welcome you both to the stage to really help us understand how we can thrive in this time ahead, hearing everything what we've already heard this afternoon. So Anne and Kai, welcome.
To set the scene and then we kick off. So Anne has a good proper photo. That's a selfie of myself on my phone yesterday. And we obviously have our handles for Twitter. Who's on Mastodon? No one's on Mastodon yet? No? You will be soon. Our last session is the Looking Ahead session. I'd just like to provide you a little bit of context from my perspective, and then we'll carry on. Some years ago, I got invited to one of those all-party parliamentary committee thingies, and this one was about management in the UK. And I was there together with Linda Grattan, who some of you may know from London Business School, as well as Julian Birkinshaw. I was running Ashridge at the time. And what we could come up with was business schools were too expensive for a lot of management education, for lower levels of management.
and they could invest in online, which no one in the government wanted to. And we concluded that leadership was about sense-making on the one hand and change management on the other. And I think that's kind of the theme. So I'm originally a historian, so if I can just kind of throw a spanner into the works and give you not the of-the-minute perspective, but the 200 years looking backwards and then looking forwards perspective. I mean, we've really screwed it up in the past 200 years, haven't we now? The Industrial Revolution started, depending on who you ask, between 1780 and 1820. That's about 200 years. In that time, we've grown the population from 500 million to 8 billion. We're into climate change. Climate changers, I know a lot of them, always talk about those 2 degrees. 2 degrees is nice, isn't it? I mean, it's quite pleasant now, 2 degrees warmer. They don't tell you what's going to happen. We're going to have, within a short period of time, 3 billion refugees in parts of the world that are uninhabitable. And Suella Braverman's going to have to sink a lot of little boats as they all want to come here. My own view on this is global warming causes desertification in large parts of the Sahara. That means there's a resource constraint. You can't grow anything. People start squabbling. It turns into a war, which turns into refugees. The refugees want to go somewhere where it's cooler. So there's something that I think we need to wrap our heads around mitigation isn't going to do it anymore. We have to think about adaptation. And for our organizations, that adaptation is starting now. It's not something we can kick down the road for 50 years. It's something that we need to really think about now if we want to be around in 50 or 100 years. Is the business that we're in sustainable in the sense of, does it make sense, you know? If we're selling sun umbrellas, that's probably pretty good. If we're trying to do ski hills in Switzerland, there's no snow anymore. So how do we deal with these kinds of questions in and around leadership, not being depressing, but being kind of realistic? I mean, there's a counterbalance to this, and I will shut up soon. If you look at Steven Pinker or Max Roser and the Our World in Data Institute at Oxford University, they're of course saying over the past 100 years, much lower child mortality, much higher women's lifetimes, smaller families, greater wealth, many, many good things. So I'm not saying everything is going to hell in a handcart, but I'm saying it's really complex what we're going to be facing with the kind of trade-offs. And one of the joys of being in academia is you're allowed to have a foul mouth. And business people tend to be very polite, you know? We were talking earlier about, you know, the dilemmas. What do you do if you're Disney in Florida and believe in LGBT plus rights? And DeSantis doesn't, and the state winds you up, right? You're stuck. There's nothing you can do. So management and leadership for me is how to balance these types of questions and try and find a way through them. If the answer was 100% black or 100% white, we wouldn't be talking about it. So you're doing a kind of a Brexit thing, 49-51, 48-52. You're going to piss off half the world no matter what you do. And that is the reality of what management seems to me to be like. And certainly what I talked about doing executive education for 15 years before I joined Coventry. And I'd like to pass over to Anne just for a perspective on, you also, we're kind of in a similar space, aren't we, about good management, developing managers, recognizing management qualities. And I'd also like your opinion on how apprenticeships are going, because I have some views on that, and I'll pass it over to you for a bit.
Okay. Well, firstly, I would say, listening to the previous discussion, there's a lot that came up that I do agree with. I like to say that actually what happened in the pandemic is the employees went to the top of the stakeholder wheel, which is an unusual position for them to be in, because let's face it, everybody's been saying in their annual reports for years, our best asset is our people, and not meaning it. But suddenly, the employees really mattered. And that's not just the frontline employees, although they, of course, mattered, but it was actually the middle and you know, the managers as well as the frontline employees. And what that then meant is that suddenly how you led and managed really mattered a lot more. And I think that created a bit of a movement about caring more about how people lead. And we've talked about Elon Musk. I am absolutely convinced that pre-pandemic, he would have swooped in, he would have said, I'm hardcore and hard ass, and everybody would have gone, oh, okay. Now, post-pandemic, where employee voice and how you lead and manage really matters much more, they're not putting up with it, right? And oh, by the way, the advertisers then aren't putting up with it. So I actually think, to your point, that the uncertainty that we find ourselves in has made management and leadership and how you lead and manage more important than ever. And the CEOs that don't get that and, you know, continue to puff on their cigars and say, don't talk to my employees, or, you know, everybody back in the office 5 days a week, are going to lose out. Because people are much more willing to vote with their feet at every level, managers and leaders. And we know that from our research. It's particularly true for younger people, but increasingly it's true, and actually it's very true for the what we call marginalized groups, the ones that were not in the majority whilst it was being screwed up the last 200 years. You know, women, minorities, disabled people, people from poor backgrounds.
Peripheral groups, the ones, where are you really from, those ones.
Yeah, and for those people as well, you know, the values and how you lead and manage matters more than ever before, and people are much, much more willing to call CEOs and senior managers out on it. And the last thing I would say is, people know. So if you are, because obviously you're all communication professionals, but we just did a major piece of research on inclusivity, all forms. 75 to 85% of those we surveyed said, of course, our company is inclusive when it comes to gender, race, disability, age, LGBTQ+. But then we said, okay, so could you name one concrete thing that your company is doing about this, that you're aware of and involved in? And suddenly, you know, the 85% dropped to 25%, in one case 5%. We call that the say-do gap. And people are much more aware, your customers, your employees, you know, your suppliers, other people that give you revenue like advertisers, they're much, much more aware of your say-do gap than they were previously. And they will call you out on it. And you know, that is happening more and more. We're seeing it more and more in social media, in the press. And again, it's another manifestation of actually your values matter more now, and how you lead and manage matters more now.
Do you think that the present situation where people don't want to go back into the office, don't want to be told what to do, is a blip, or do you think it's here to stay?
So it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I and most of them think it's here to stay. Because the genie's out of the bottle, right? People discovered, well, of course we can be productive. You know, of course we can fill in the blank, publish a national newspaper, host a board meeting, run a bank remotely. And it made people able to fit their work around their lives. And 82% of our managers and leaders said, of course we want to continue in a hybrid fashion. But the word is hybrid. And you know, to your point, it's never really black or white. It's gray, right? And so, of course, people want to go back into the office. We're social human beings, but they don't want to go back into the office and sit on Zoom calls. And again, that's about management. You have to think as a manager, why am I bringing my people back into the office? Is it for something meaningful? You know, who am I bringing back into the office? The worst scenario you have is all the senior guys on the exec floor, and then, you know, all the people in the middle and the bottom are actually not coming back. And that's just reinforcing that divide. And you'll, you know, that's a real watch out, actually.
Yeah, must happen to many of us in the room. I live in West Hampstead and work up in Coventry, so it's 2 hours 15 each way. And when I get all that way to sit on a Teams call with someone who's not there, it just seems
you get annoyed. You say, why am I doing this, right? And that's what people realized, you know, and so they know it works, and they know it's better for them. And so, you know, that's why you keep reading, you know, some CEO is now called back in the office 5 days a week, and everybody's going, nah.
No. Yeah, there was a thing in HR Grapevine yesterday about people just ignoring it.
Exactly.
We had a 3-line whip. None of us do it.
No.
Imagine telling academics at a university to turn up every day. You're going to lose, right?
Well, yeah, and it isn't just academics, although obviously an obstreperous bunch, right? but it's, you know, it's people at Microsoft. It's people, you know, in banks. It's people in the civil service, right? It's quite widespread.
Yeah. The only reason people are going in is because it's cold at home. Heating is
Heating
expensive.
yes, that's
so you
true.
might as well turn up at the office and warm up. I mentioned also developing leaders, and you've been working on it at the CMI, from both the CMI leader programs, as well as keeping an eye on the troops over the years, and also apprenticeships. Have you seen changes in how leadership is developed? Have you tried to do different things? I know you had the framework and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, we have. We've just updated that framework. It's our management professional standards, so we create standards and then we assess against them. And in the center of the framework now, we've actually put, you know, being an ethical, inclusive leader, because we know, and this is actually, again, quite critical, and I don't think that we can emphasize this enough. Having diverse viewpoints and bringing in diverse pools of talent into your workforce at every level does a number of things. It does deliver better innovation, better decision-making, better results. It enables you, you know, if you think about those concerns that Sandra was talking about, the ability to attract and retain talent, it is essential for doing that. And it is essential for actually growth, which is what we're really trying to get in this, in the UK context in particular. So it is everybody's job, every manager and leader's job, to create an inclusive environment and to close that say-do gap. And it isn't the ED&I guy or gal's job. It's an essential part of line management, and that's a huge change. And by the way, so is sustainability, right? So unless we can hardwire these things into what it means to be a modern manager and leader, and we're all taking everyday practical steps to make sure that we're actually doing it, we will not be anywhere near as successful or prosperous, and we won't grow as much.
Yeah, so in the business school landscape, we have to report against the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, and obviously some clean water doesn't have a whole lot to do with the business school, but a lot of them do, but we looked at them. Who's read through the UN's SDGs? Good, yeah. Have you gone down into the, not only the 17, but then the whatever they are, and then the 7 million ones where they actually tell you what it all is? Quite complex.
Well, it is, but somebody said earlier, and you know, hiding behind ESG. And I do think, you know, there is a lot of that still going on. And people are, you know, some of it's legitimate because they don't really know. But there's much more understanding and rallying crying going on the E and the G than there is on the S. And that's, so if you look at, for example, what progress have we really made on becoming a more diverse and inclusive society. Let's just take the leaders and managers in the UK. Yeah. This piece of work we did showed, you know, we're still missing, if you match labor force participation with who's managing and leading the place, you know, we're still missing close to 2 million managers, you know, 500,000 women, 420 from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, 270 disabled, 100,000 ethnically diverse, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not diversity anywhere near enough in the management and leadership population and in the population taking decisions.
Yeah.
And that's still an issue.
Yeah, that's why I'm at Coventry, to try and kind of plug that gap, because I think it only works. And what I definitely learned at Ashridge is it's a long-term project.
It is a long-term project.
You know, somebody earlier on said lots of, you were saying about how books, you know, by the time kids are 2 or 3, if you look at the neuroscience of it all, if they're from households with no books, they're toast for the rest of their lives, practically. So we need to start with the early start, sure start kind of programs. Then they can get to Coventry when they're 17. Then they can join the CMI, and then they can be put on a board where they're 40. If they're 39 and poor and you put them on the board, they're going to just have real trouble with it. And so this is always terrible for a middle-aged white guy, not from here to say, but we saw in the kind of Emiratization, Saudification, South Africa, and I shudder to say the same for groups that are underrepresented. You need to accelerate their experience somehow to be able to get them to understand the context that they have to think about things in. That requires all our efforts to make sure it's just simply possible. Otherwise, you're just guaranteeing someone will fail. You send some poor kid to Oxford without any support. They're not going to do very well.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned apprenticeships. It is something that we do. Well, again, it's part of we developed the IP with employers for the management and leadership apprenticeship standard. We don't deliver it. Coventry does. But what's really interesting, we've just done a major piece of work about apprenticeships, so management apprenticeships. Who's doing them? Well, you know what's really interesting? 71% of the management apprentices had parents that did not go to university. And if you look at the socioeconomic background of these apprentices, 39% are from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. Only 27% of typical university students are from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. So it is having a positive impact on social mobility. And it's also having a positive impact on progression, because your point is, and this is also so important for companies, I hear this all the time, oh, we fixed our woman problem, fill in the blank, because half our intake is women. Well, I guarantee you, 3 years from now, as they're moving up, they'll be gone. And so unless you have progression, which is your point, for these very diverse groups, and you think very practically about who am I promoting, and why, and is that, am I really inclusive in that process, and am I making it on the basis of performance and outcome, not presence, for example, or flattery. That becomes so important.
Totally. What I've seen with the apprenticeships is it's changed the market, the educational landscape quite a lot, more at the exec ed end actually than at the undergrad. The undergrad nurses are now all doing apprenticeships because the nurse subsidy went away. So that's how that works. But the corporations are not spending on exec ed anymore because they figure they want to get their tax back. So they're doing the apprenticeships in many cases. Too many level 7. Level 7 is master's degrees, business apprenticeships for all and sundry to spend money as quickly as possible. And the problem with them, we were talking earlier in the day about regulation and some of the regulators. Who do you think regulates apprenticeships now? It's Ofsted. It's insane. Ofsted does kindergartens. So we're being inspected for our ability to teach British values, whatever those might be. We're being inspected on whether we are safeguarding them. A lot of our students at level 7 are head teachers. They're in their mid-40s. We're supposed to make sure we don't molest them, and you're not supposed to molest the under 18s or vulnerable adults. But we got to put this whole show on about how we have an infrastructure in place at a university with 40,000 students for a couple of thousand apprenticeship students who are in their 40s about these bonkers things. And the way Ofsted works is they give you a call on a Thursday and they say, we're coming with a team of 12 on Monday for all of next week. So we're counting down, that we know we're going to get inspected soon. We're counting down every Thursday we survive without a phone call as a step closer to heaven, or in my case, retirement, So we think we're good for this year because we have no more students if they give us a call today for next week. They're all on break already, so this is good.
Okay. Well, what is true is, because I was just reading this today actually, if you are a university and you are delivering a degree apprenticeship, because they have proven popular with undergrads as well as existing employees. And by the way, there is nothing wrong with upskilling your existing employees. If we're going to solve the talent problem, we do need to do that. And if we're going to get better management, we do need to do that. But the universities that deliver degree apprenticeships are far more likely to get rated the top 2 ratings from Ofsted than those that don't. So, keep delivering the apprenticeships, it'll be fine.
If you get something evil like needs improvement, they prevent you from recruiting any new ones, so you got to teach out. So we're all keeping an eye on each other on who gets a black mark to then go hoover up all of theirs. So it's all a bit nuts, but it is. So in some ways, if it were up to me and I were running a company that wanted to develop the pipeline, I would take more responsibility. I probably wouldn't do the state-funded apprenticeships because of all the hoops and hurdles that are involved. I would really think about what is needed. I would try and do something where people are working and studying at the same time so that the kids make some money and not exploit them. And I do think that we're going to have to grow our own pipelines. They're not going to fall from heaven. We're not allowed to bring them in from the EU anymore, are we? We're not allowed to bring them in from anywhere anymore.
Well, we need a long-term skills policy that grows talent in this country, right? And yes, we should plug the short-term gaps. You know, I'm very on board with employers wanting to plug short-term skills gaps through immigration, whether that's in agriculture, whether it's in hospitality, whether it's, you know, because we can't grow our own that quickly. But if I go back to this employee stakeholder thing, you know, we have a lot of people who have left the workforce, older people, for example. And what would be great is to attract a lot of them back in. Now, what works to attract older people back into the workplace? Well, things like flexibility. And it actually doesn't only, I'm not only talking about knowledge work, which, you know, you can work from home, I can work from home, many of you can work from home, because we're not, you know, serving in a store or in a McDonald's. But even shift work, if you give flexibility, and you can use technology to do this, you get more engagement and you find it easier to attract talent. And if you have better management and leadership, you find it much easier to retain that talent. And better also means more diverse, because if people do not see people who look like themselves above them, they will leave. And that's why, you know, we keep perennially filling the bottom quartile, but unless the second and third and fourth quartile get more diverse, we're never going to fix the problem. Mm-hmm. And that's why management really does matter.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that I was doing earlier in the week, and I've done it for 6 or 7 years, as being a judge for the Institute of Customer Service Awards. Mm-hmm. And Joe used to be at the CMI way back in the day, and that's always interesting. This year there was big companies, and they're only going to be announced in March at the Hilton on Park Lane. But you kind of read through them, and there's a challenge. I think also maybe Sandra has an opinion on this. It's hard to build a good reputation, but you know when you don't like something. Yeah. Yes. You know that I won't go to a Weatherspoons. I don't like Weatherspoons. I don't like the philosophy. I don't like the guy. I will never set foot in a Weatherspoons ever, right? So I know that kind of thing. I know what brands I won't buy. It's not rational in all cases, but I just don't want to buy Tommy Hilfiger. I won't wear it, right? It's no. So I don't know why, but so there's this interesting thing about the repelling kind of reputation as well as a welcoming reputation. And surely also the treatment of staff have a lot to do with that.
Huge. You know, Paul Pullman at Unilever, who is a great proponent of, he has this thing, net positive, which is not only should businesses, you know, have purpose at their core and give back in a productive way that builds their brands. And they did find at Unilever that brands that adopted a purpose outgrew brands that didn't, and whether that was Dove or Lifebuoy soap, right? And Lifebuoy soap purpose, just because you might think, oh God, soap purpose, but it was about, they realized that every child that washed their hands and everybody that washed their hands in third world countries, they saved the lives of 5 children. So that became the purpose of Lifebuoy soap, and they sold a lot more Lifebuoy soap that way, right? So it is, you know, it's contextual, but he found that when he adopted that sustainable living and purpose-driven and inclusive leadership, that he went from 12th position on LinkedIn with graduates to number 1. And suddenly he was drowning in talent. You know, everybody wanted to work at Unilever. So it absolutely matters, particularly for younger generations. And, you know, there are going to be sectors, and I know I have people, good friends in the legal sector, they're paying a fortune, but they still find it super hard to attract the talent, because, especially diverse talent, because it's just like, well, no, it's not the money. It's not going to do it for me. I want a life. I want values. I want purpose. I want to like where I work. And I think that that's the way it's going to stay.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me because there's always that dilemma between I'm young and I have my ideals, and oh my God, I have a mortgage and the interest rate on the mortgage just went up from 1 to 6.25, do I have to bite my tongue and, bow down to the man, as it were, or can I keep things up?
Yeah, it's and people I think are very perplexed, and I've heard a lot of senior leaders and managers muddle over this. That even when they're faced with inflation, they're still quitting if they don't like the company and its values, and it's become much easier and much more common for younger people to have something on the side hustle. Technology makes that easier, but they're more willing to do it. And the other thing, was asked, the last session talked about should CEOs speak out, and I just thought this was quite interesting. Earlier this week, I had the fortune to interview John Pepper. I'm ex-P&G, and he, of course, retired a while ago. He's in his 80s, still very sharp. He was chair of Disney for 5 years. And so I asked him about Disney.
Yeah, we're all fascinated with Bob Iger and the politics. And
yeah, and he was very clear. He didn't hesitate at all. He said, that was a mistake. We should have signed the letter. We should have spoken out. We should have been clear. Our employees demanded it. We should have listened to them. And that was his point of view, right? And his point of view is, as CEOs, and I think this is Paul Pullman's point of view, you do have to speak out on these issues. You do have to do the right thing, because if you don't, you will get caught out. Whether it's your corporate brand will definitely suffer. I agree with the statement earlier that you can't dissect this thing. One brand for the product, one brand for the employee, one brand for the investors. People they'll smell that.
I mean, so I think you have to choose sides often. You can't please everybody. And as a historian, you look at revolutions, yeah? To try and be a liberal, rational person in the Russian Revolution, in the French Revolution, in Germany in the 1930s, what did you accomplish? Both sides hated you because you were trying to sit on the fence. So you're better off being way out there with some sort of crazy Marxists. At least only half the people hate you then. So you have a better chance of survival. And I think, I wouldn't want to be in the States now as a business person. It's a country tearing itself apart, it seems to me.
Yeah, but beware the say-do gap. So what really is the worst of all worlds is you take a side, we saw this with Black Lives Matter, quite frankly. So many people and companies and CEOs taking sides, publishing positions, tweeting stuff, and then doing nothing. And that is the worst of all worlds, because that's what people see through. And they start to use technology to do it. In this country, the gender pay gap, when it was released, somebody did a Twitter bot that every time a CEO tweeted about, gender progress is important, that bot went to the data set, found their actual gender pay gap, and tweeted that. And of course, say-do gap, right? All these CEOs saying women are so important to us. Oh, we have a 50% gender pay gap, So it's.
But the companies in the States that are willing to support women traveling for abortions, that's like not a say-do gap. That's real.
That is real.
But that's dangerous also on the one hand, because there's nutcases out there.
Well, yeah, but actually you can say, and this is the political analyst like John King on CNN will back this up. The midterms did surprise people, but they shouldn't have that much, because abortion played a much bigger role in those results than the pollsters predicted.
Yeah. So it's all very interesting. Anything else looking ahead that you're seeing on the horizon that is worth discussing here from a perspective of reputation, brand, or life in general?
Just greater agility, right? So I think this is what we've seen is, the rise of employee voice, being more flexible, being more agile. That's how you're going to cope with uncertainty on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have to anchor it even more in your values and in better management and leadership. You have to make sure that not just you as a CEO and not just your C-suite, but your middle managers, the ones leading your frontline people, your senior managers are doing a good job. It is absolutely the case that the biggest correlation between performance, engagement, and happiness and satisfaction at work is the relationship with the line manager. There's lots of research on that, and I just this week saw some more. So it matters more than ever, and that is also the modern manager is much more agile. They do things on principle and on values, not on rule books.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because I was going to say, at universities we tie ourselves into terrible knots. Part of that is because of a level of bureaucracy within the university that just seems to be bloat. Anyone who's read Graeber, who died's book on bullshit jobs, you know, there are lots of them in higher education, there are lots of them in government, and the way they were identified is by asking people whether their job, if it disappeared, would do any harm to the organization. Graeber was at the LSE, and something like 40% of white-collar jobs say you don't need me. And this came out before the pandemic, where you go, we need the nurses, we need the garbage truck people, we don't need paper pushers in universities, but that's neither here nor there. And the second dilemma is the way we interpret regulation over-regulates. It's this weird thing. I don't want to be a regulator's actor-outer, but the people we have in registry and GDPR and all of these functions around the university are such scaredy cats that they tell you can't do anything, you know?
Well, if you lead anything like ESG or any of this reputation with a compliance mindset, which is what you're talking about, you're doomed to fail, because it isn't about compliance, it's about innovation, growth, and efficiency. It's actually about better performance. And looking at Sandra's charts, and I wasn't surprised to see this, but I did think, it showed that the diversity agenda is less important for a lot of people. But don't people see the correlation between that and attracting and retaining talent and getting innovation? I mean, that was to me like, oh, well, that's a bit of a miss, because it's absolutely essential. And, the world is getting more diverse too, right? So if you want the talent, you're going to have to actually do a better job.
Or you want to understand your customer base.
Yes. Well, yeah, and that means the customer base is more diverse, the employee base is more diverse. And so you have to be more diverse if you're going to continue to build your brand reputation. Yeah. And that will drive the things that people really did care about that were in that top quartile and the upper half of the chart.
Yeah, all very interesting. Keeping an eye on time, we have been talking for about half an hour. It's always nice to actually involve people, so I don't know if anyone has any comments to chip in with or questions. Oh, that's very good. Do we all think the world is going to end? No? Think everything will be sorted out? No?
Thank you. That was a really interesting discussion. My name's Kate Levine, and I work for myself as a consultant in corporate communications and brand activism. Anne, you talked a couple of times about, you mentioned flexibility, you also talked about the gender pay gap, and you talked about being able to engage sections of the community that maybe have decided they don't want to work anymore, they don't want to work in the same way that you used to. And you also talked about misguided corporations perhaps thinking that we're fine with women, we've got plenty of them, but as you said, you bet in 3 years' time they'll go. So I wanted to come back to flexibility. There obviously isn't enough flexibility in the workforce, and I definitely think that underrepresented groups are more likely to remain in the workforce if there is. Do we need more regulation around flexibility? If corporations aren't doing it, and they're not quickly enough seeing the benefit of introducing flexibility, do we need something else?
Well, it's a great question. There was in the Employee Rights Bill a clause that said the default is flexible working, but it got struck, like a lot of things. And, I think that, so I do think that there could be a greater regulatory framework that would encourage it. I think what's important to me is two things. One, I really think that government should get much more on the front foot with data collection. I think the gender pay gap monitoring was a good thing. I could not for the life of me understand why it wasn't extended to ethnicity, disability, other things that really matter, because it forces transparency and measurement. And it makes people aware of where they stand. And, you know, what gets measured gets managed, that old adage. So I think that's very disappointing. I also think that there should be consequences for inaction. So transparency with teeth. So if you aren't if you aren't publishing, and we now know in ESG it is part of the framework that you have to have this stuff, but if you don't have action plans and you don't make any progress, there should be consequences. You know, fines, for example, right? Because that would, you know, encourage more people to act. But the last thing, and this is, we can't forget that 99%, I know many of you will be in big businesses, but 99% of the businesses in this country are small. So we really also have to emphasize that if you want to attract and retain talent, get more innovation and grow, you need to pay attention to these things. And I think that there's also a government messaging missing. That's missing. And I think somebody said to it before, I think it was you, Kai, it all gets branded woke and it's all negative. It's not woke. It's actually good business sense. And that's what we need to keep articulating. And because people forget that.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tim Lefroy. I was an apprentice, but that was over 50 years ago. And I wanted to observe two things about your piece. First of all, to thank you, because this has been, for me, this whole wonderful session with ECHO has been a bit of a game of two halves, in the sense that earlier on, Sir Michael Rake gave us a picture which didn't leave much cause for optimism. And you've come on now and you've given us this wonderful, energetic session and very upbeat piece, and some philosophies, particularly from Anne, that I completely agree with, and some from you, Kai, which I kind of recognize and understand about the way the bureaucracy and the things surrounding your world in universities. And so I'd almost like to capture this energy and upbeat bit of this session, asking you a question that if you just like to pick, it almost doesn't matter which shade of government we get from 2024 going on, but what your 2 or 3 pieces of advice that you would give and programs that you don't currently see, maybe in relation to the NHS, which seems to be in a big problem at the moment, how you would take some of these ideas that you've talked about, agility, adaptiveness, etc., and translate them to government first and maybe NHS after that.
Well, that's a small question, isn't it? So there's a couple of things. We have said that really 3 things. One, we need to give companies incentives to invest in developing their people. And I'm not just talking about an apprenticeship levy. I'm talking about something far more systematic. You know, we give all these write-offs for R&D investment. We give all these write-offs for, you know, all kinds of infrastructure investment. What about people investment? That's also a longer-term capital project, isn't it? You know, it's not just buying kit, and it's training people. That takes time. So we would love to see that. Incentives, because British business, and I know that many of you are global, but they spend half of what Europe spends, for example, on developing their talent. It's not anywhere near enough. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, I really think we need to get the data, you know, across all of these characteristics, make it mandatory to measure it. Most companies have it. It's not that difficult to get, and the more that we get better at asking for it, the better that we get at. And 80% of the CMI folks said, yes, of course we want an ethnicity pay gap. They agreed. The CEOs in the FTSE agreed. So that's just obvious, and I would extend it beyond to the other characteristics that we've talked about. And then the last thing, actually, this is quite an interesting one, and the US does this, which I thought, that's quite interesting. So you can't get federal money unless you have a diversity and inclusion policy and you put it into practice. So what if you couldn't get any government contracts unless you had, you know, some of these things and action plans and you were making progress? Because let's face it, the government is a huge customer, biggest customer of consulting, et cetera. So that would stimulate a lot of action. In terms of the NHS, I just think that so much of their issue is around collaboration and better leadership and management. And you know, a little story, one of the NHS trusts was rated needs improvement. And so what they did is they, for the first time ever, put their entire management on the same course. It was, okay, it's a plug for CMI, it was a chartered manager degree apprenticeship, but you had the chief clinician, the head nurse, the night porter, you know, the lab guy, and all sorts of mixed people. And you put them through the same course with the same objective. How do we improve patient outcomes so we can get our CQC rating up? Now, this was not a quick fix. It took 3 or 4 years. But it was the first time they'd all worked together to solve a common problem, right? Instead of in their silos. So they all did the course. They all graduated. It was Henley. Sorry, Kai. And that hospital went from needs improvement to outstanding because they all collaborated together and delivered better management and leadership outcomes.
On Addenbrooke's, where they decided that what they needed to do was get patients out of the hospital. And at some point you ask yourself, you're reading this article in the FT, article this big, you're like, does no one manage in the NHS? Because it was shocking, right? And then comments after were, yeah, why is this doesn't sound that difficult to me. The doctor doesn't come around to check you out. So you're lying there on Friday, doctor doesn't come, you're lying there on Saturday, you're lying there on Sunday, doctor rocks up on Monday, you've just blocked a bed for 3 days for no reason whatsoever. I've checked myself out of hospitals because I just had enough, right? Oh, you might die. Oh, I'm going to die if I lie around here any longer.
Yeah, it's a complex problem, but you know, better management and leadership, not necessarily just throw money at it. I'm sorry that you checked yourself out. But again, that's a silo, part of that, and it is known. It's the care silo. You know, the care homes, there's no beds in the care homes, so they can't move the people out of the hospital into the care homes, right? So it's about looking more systematically and collaborating more systematically to fix these, you know, these ecosystem problems. And it's the same with leveling up, devolution, right? There's a reason I believe that Germany and the US are more productive. They're federalist. The states and the communities have far more say in how they spend the money, how they develop the infrastructure, how they develop the labor force, how they work together to create ecosystems, whether it's Silicon Valley or Charlotte or Pittsburgh. Those are all great examples. And I think here, to level up, you can't do it if it's all centralized.
Yeah. And surely the care system is not separate from the healthcare system.
No, it's not.
if you turn your thinking cap on.
Yes.
Yeah, but it is, so, yeah, all very funny. I mean, the thing that gets up my nose right now is this, that came out last week, that all students were now migrants. You know, first of all, they counted when there weren't any, because everyone was under lockdown. So it's gone from 50,000 to 500,000 students. The 2021 goal was 500,000 students or whatever it was. You don't want their money, you don't want to keep them. It costs us £150,000 to subsidize a doctor, and then you're going to kick them out again?
I can help you. Education in this country is a bigger export than financial services. Yeah. So why the hell would you shoot yourselves in the foot by capping it? It's one of the great British contributions to the global economy.
Yeah,
right?
The 9,250 that the British students pay via the loan scheme is worth 6,500 now. From when it was introduced to now it is. And you can argue what it costs to educate a student. Most universities say about 9. But anyone who's done activity-based costing knows that that's, you know, a very, very difficult area to be certain about. But the universities would all go to hell in a handcart without international students, both from finances but also intellectually. And we've already cut ourselves off from EU funding. There are no EU students kicking around.
It's an export,
really a tragedy.
Not just of financial merit, but it's that soft power. It's all, they go back, they have British values, they believe in the British system. You know, it's very, very important. And, you know, again, what does the US do? They take that out of the immigration number. And I can't believe that this country, because it's such a big export, wouldn't do the same. So that would be the other government policy.
Do you want to be in the government?
No. Well, that's part of the issue, isn't it? Yeah. Government is very badly managed. Oops. Well, it's true.
Last question. Charles.
Charles Tilley, IRCC. You mentioned you would never go into Wetherspoons. There are companies such as Ryanair, who are focused on two things: safety and the lowest cost operator possible, and on that basis they can then attract customers. You also have situations where they do a survey and say, do you like free-range chicken? Absolutely. And then, will you buy free-range chicken when you can find out that it's actually 4 times more expensive than very badly brought up chicken? How do you reconcile what you've been talking about with customer behaviour and companies which are focused on making profit at all costs and are actually successful over the long term?
That's such a difficult space to wander into. I think about that, Charles, all the time from, sage advice on how to save money in the cost of living crisis. I mean, I go to Aldi's and Lidl's, I shop at my ethnic stores, but I will eat proper chicken because otherwise I won't eat it. But if it's coming from, some fat old white-haired white man giving sage advice to the poor of the country on how to cook, I'm not going anywhere near that. That'll just end in tears for me. Will I buy something?
That's a very personal view.
Will I go to Ryanair? I fly Ryanair all the time to my house in Spain, right? Which also has a certain irony. I'm going to spend a $5
One of the things that Ryanair did right, and it's back to this employee thing, they kept their employees, and they did not get caught out in the employee shortage. Mm-hmm. So they could actually fly the planes, right, and move the bags. And now that's why they're making $1 billion in profit, and EasyJet is, is well below them now. So I think there's more than just, he wanted to make money. He was sensible enough not to fire everybody.
Do they reconcile with all the values you've just been talking about? That's my question.
No, but I think that what they did do right was just recognize that they can't just lay off massively. And I don't know, I wonder if, I was very scared at that stat that 68% of pilots don't know how to fly the plane. I don't know, I hope that the Ryanair pilots know how to fly the plane. Don't know, they tend to be younger.
But you get that nice little jingle when you land on time.
Big questions, big topics. Just a really, really interesting day. I must thank all of you for joining us today, for our wonderful speakers. And ending on, we did want to end on a high. We did want to end on, these are some genuine, practical things we can all think about. And it all starts with us. Yeah, it all starts with us in various ways when we talk about purpose, values, culture, people. The things that we can all help, either in terms of how we lead our own organizations or how we support those we're guiding and advising. So really, I hope there's been something for everyone today. I know we've touched on a lot of subjects in a lot of different areas, but I hope you've all found it really useful. And again, from our perspective and from all at ECHO, just delighted to have you with us, delighted to share these perspectives with you, and really, again, to just underscore all these things, all the issues around change and transformation and taking people with you. We firmly believe in really sound, rigorous insight, foresight, and support, so that you do really take everyone across the whole organization through this journey of change, aiming for better. So thank you, and please, I hope you can join us for drinks and continue discussions with the wonderful Anne and Kai and all our other speakers. And the only thing I will finish on is we've talked a lot about actions rather than just words, and avoiding the say-do gap. And I was privileged to join Anne at your 75th anniversary dinner last week. And I have never been to a more diverse energizing, inspirational evening ever in my life. And Anne, that's down to your leadership and what you do at the CMI. It is truly outstanding. And those of you who don't know about the CMI, please look into it. I have some great, great things come from the organization. So thank you. Thank you all.